In the late 1990s, a place known more for cobblestone streets and cafe chatter than Bloodshed became the stage for something unthinkable. Quebec, proud and prosperous, slipped into chaos as bombs ripped through neighborhoods and gunfire echoed in broad daylight. Ordinary families lived in fear, never knowing if the next target might be a rival gangster or an innocent child. At the heart of it all was an ambition so ruthless its full truth wouldn't be revealed until the very end. The spark in a peaceful province. Quebec in the early 1990s was not the place anyone expected to see a war unfold. Known for its vibrant culture, historic cities, and prosperous industries, the province was far removed from the chaos of organized crime battles that dominated headlines in New York, Chicago, or Los Angeles. For most citizens, biker gangs were background noise, a rough presence at bars, loud motorcycles at rallies, but nothing that disturbed the rhythm of daily life. But beneath that surface calm, Quebec was changing. Cocaine and hashish were flowing in from abroad, funneled through the docks of Montreal and dispersed across the province. Small street gangs and independent dealers were making fortunes. And above them, two shadowy forces loomed: the Montreal Mafia, which controlled smuggling routes and union politics, and the outlaw motorcycle clubs, who provided muscle and distribution. The uneasy balance of this ecosystem meant everyone had a slice of the pie, until one group decided they wanted it all. The Hells Angels had already earned a fearsome reputation in Canada. Their bloody purge of the Laval chapter in 1985, known as the Lennoxville massacre, showed that they were willing to kill their own members if loyalty faltered. That massacre not only solidified their dominance, but also sent shockwaves through the criminal underworld, warning anyone who dared to cross them. By the early 1990s, the Angels were positioned as the dominant force in Quebec's biker scene. But their ambition extended beyond simple respect. They wanted monopoly. At first, it was subtle. Bar owners and small-time dealers were approached quietly, pressured to buy exclusively from Hells Angels suppliers. Some agreed out of fear, others out of convenience. But when refusals came, retaliation followed. Fires burned down establishments, families received threats. The message was unmistakable: cooperate or disappear. Still, resistance lingered. Among those unwilling to bend was a rival motorcycle club with its own ambitions: the Rock Machine. Formed by Salvatore Cazzetta, a man who once had close ties to the Hells Angels, the Rock Machine represented more than just another gang. They were an organized, disciplined, and well-connected force with business interests across Montreal. Their independence made them dangerous. Their allies made them even more so. What no one yet realized was how quickly the friction between these two groups would ignite. In the summer of 1994, the uneasy peace shattered. A Hells Angel was gunned down in his own repair shop. Another attack followed within hours, and then a foiled bombing attempt exposed just how far the rivals were willing to go. The first shots had been fired, and they marked the beginning of a conflict that would turn quiet streets into battlegrounds. Quebec was about to become the stage for the deadliest biker war the world had ever seen. And while the public read headlines about bombs and shootings, very few understood what fueled this sudden eruption of violence. It wasn't random chaos, it was the spark of a plan years in the making, a plan with one man's ruthless ambition at its core. The making of Mom. Long before Quebec's streets echoed with explosions, before headlines called him the most feared biker in Canada, Maurice Boucher was just another boy in a crowded working-class family. Born in 1953, his upbringing carried all the seeds of what he would later become. His father was a construction worker, a hard man with a violent temper and a drinking problem. His mother, by contrast, was gentle, nurturing, and protective. To young Maurice, she was the one source of warmth in a home otherwise filled with fear. 8 children crowded that household, and discipline came in the form of fists. His father's beatings taught him early that power flowed from violence. He carried that lesson with him into school, where teachers described him as indifferent, a boy who lacked focus, who drifted between classes and streets with no real drive except rebellion. By 9th grade, he was gone. Dropping out coincided with another development: drugs, alcohol, marijuana, cocaine, LSD. Boucher experimented with all of them. Addiction took hold fast. He wanted excitement, not stability, and his substance use reflected that. By 19, he was desperate enough to commit armed robberies just to keep himself supplied. He robbed a convenience store for $300, then broke into homes, stealing cigarettes and small cash. Inevitably, he was caught. Sentenced to 6 months, he got his first taste of prison, a place he'd come to know all too well. Prison didn't rehabilitate him, it refined him. Guards and other inmates alike noted his lack of empathy, his cold detachment. A police psychologist who evaluated him at the time called him ambitious yet emotionally barren. "He wants wealth without work," she wrote, noting how he rationalized violence as a natural solution to problems. After his release, Boucher drifted again, working briefly in factories but never holding a steady job. His real focus lay elsewhere. He gravitated toward outlaw bikers, men who shared his taste for drugs, rebellion, and easy money. In the late 1970s, he joined a small white supremacist biker gang called the SS. This wasn't the Nazi elite force, but a crude group of working-class men who thrived on intimidation and petty crime. Their activities ranged from drug dealing to beating up immigrants in Montreal. It was here that Boucher discovered something. He had a natural talent for leadership. He wasn't eloquent, some even mocked his inability to string words together in public, but he had presence. He could intimidate, charm, and command through sheer force of personality. Members followed him because they feared him, and that fear translated into respect. During this period, Boucher struck up a friendship with Salvatore Cazzetta, another rising figure in Quebec's biker scene. The two men shared ambitions and bonded through their violent exploits. Their paths, however, would one day diverge in ways neither could imagine. One joining the Hells Angels, the other founding the Rock Machine, the very group that would one day stand in Boucher's way. By the early 1980s, Boucher had established himself as more than just a street thug. He was building a reputation as a man to be feared. He smiled for cameras at funerals, basking in the twisted publicity even when he had nothing to say. He was learning the theater of crime, the power of image and myth. What no one yet saw was how far he was willing to take that lesson. The boy who had grown up with fists as lullabies was preparing to carve out his empire with the same brutal logic. Violence as destiny. Violence as a lesson. If Boucher's childhood taught him that violence was unavoidable, his early years in crime convinced him that violence was also useful. The line between necessity and strategy blurred quickly. Each time he returned to prison, each time he came back to the streets, his understanding of how the world worked grew sharper and darker. By the mid-1970s, Quebec's underworld was a patchwork of small gangs, each staking claims in bars, pool halls, and construction rackets. These were not empires, just fiefdoms. But even in this fragmented landscape, brutality carried weight. Men who could command fear ruled over those who hesitated. Boucher understood this better than most. His father's union had been under the thumb of André Desjardins, a union boss tied to the Montreal mafia. Desjardins ruled not with policy, but with fists, bribes, and intimidation. As a boy, Boucher had watched workers fall in line under Desjardins' orders, no matter how unfair or corrupt. The lesson stuck. Men respected fear more than fairness. When he joined the SS biker gang, violence wasn't just an initiation, it was the currency. Members carried out beatings on immigrants and rivals. Boucher, stoned half the time, still stood out for his sheer willingness to inflict pain. Fellow bikers described him as reckless, even unhinged. But that recklessness made him valuable muscle. Leaders sent him when they wanted someone intimidated, and he delivered. He also developed a taste for spectacle. At funerals, when cameras appeared, Boucher would step into the frame, grinning, surrounded by his men. He rarely spoke, but his smile carried its own message. "I'm not afraid of you." It was theater, calculated to build a reputation that would travel faster than rumors. He was crafting a myth for himself, a dangerous man who enjoyed being seen as dangerous. But violence also brought consequences. In the early 1980s, he was convicted of sexual assault against a teenage girl, earning another prison sentence. It was in these cells that he refined his persona further. Other inmates respected his toughness, but they also noticed his cunning. He didn't just fight for survival, he fought to control. Guards saw it too. To them, Boucher was trouble incarnate, always calculating, always ready to manipulate others for his own gain. Outside the prison walls, biker culture was changing. The Hells Angels had crossed into Canada, bringing with them a level of organization and ruthlessness unmatched by local gangs. Their massacre of the Laval chapter in 1985 shocked even hardened criminals. To some, it was a betrayal of the outlaw code. To others, like Boucher, it was genius, a reminder that purges and fear could hold an empire together. This was the final reinforcement of the lesson he had been learning his whole life. Violence wasn't just acceptable, it was necessary. It could cleanse weakness. It could enforce loyalty. It could expand power, and it could build legends. When Boucher finally left prison behind for good, he wasn't just another biker looking for thrills. He was a man convinced that his future lay in using violence not as a last resort, but as his sharpest tool. The streets of Quebec would soon discover just how far he was willing to wield it. Lennoxville's ghost. The spring of 1985 marked a turning point in Canadian organized crime. At a quiet clubhouse in Lennoxville, Quebec, the Hells Angels demonstrated just how far they were willing to go to preserve order. What began as a party invitation for members of the Laval chapter ended as a massacre. One by one, the Laval bikers were herded into a room and gunned down by their own brothers. By the time it was over, 5 men lay dead. The motive was simple but chilling. The Laval chapter had become unruly, unpredictable, and too noisy for the comfort of the organization's leadership. They stole from allies, ignored rules, and drew police attention like moths to flame. Rather than tolerate the risk, the Angels chose the nuclear option: eliminate them. Overnight, the Hells Angels proved they would sacrifice their own without hesitation if it served the bigger picture. News of the Lennoxville massacre spread like wildfire. Even in the underworld, where loyalty was often fragile, there was an unwritten code. You didn't kill your brothers. The Angels shattered that illusion, shocking allies and rivals alike. To many, it was proof the Angels were too ruthless to be trusted. Among those most disgusted was Salvatore Cazzetta, who had been circling the Angels with an eye toward joining. The massacre changed everything. Instead of patching over, Cazzetta founded his own gang, the Rock Machine. His decision would set the stage for the bloodbath to come. Maurice Boucher, however, saw the Lennoxville massacre differently. Where others saw betrayal, he saw brilliance. He admired the cold efficiency, the willingness to cross boundaries no one else dared. To him, it was not cowardice, but strength. He concluded that the Hells Angels were not just another gang, they were the future. When the offer came, he didn't hesitate. In 1986, Boucher became a full-patch member of the Montreal chapter. That choice would alter Quebec forever. Boucher's loyalty to the Angels was not blind. It was calculated. He recognized that aligning himself with the world's most infamous biker club gave him access to an international network, resources far greater than any local gang, and a reputation that traveled farther than bullets. Within a year, he was climbing the ladder. He proved his commitment in blood, carrying out assassinations with chilling calm. Witnesses saw him gun down rivals in crowded bars, yet no one dared testify. Fear alone was enough to protect him. But the Lennoxville ghosts lingered. Survivors of the Purge turned informant, their testimony sending dozens of Angels to prison. Leadership positions opened, and Boucher was ready to fill them. By the late 1980s, he was no longer a foot soldier. He was president of the Montreal chapter, a man whose word carried the weight of life and death. The Rock Machine, meanwhile, grew steadily under Cazzetta, building alliances and embedding themselves into Montreal's nightlife. Their very existence was a rebuke to the Angels' monopoly. For years, tension simmered, but open conflict was held back. The two former friends, Cazzetta and Boucher, were now leaders on a collision course. When the first shots finally rang out in 1994, it wasn't just a gang war, it was the ghost of Lennoxville returning to haunt Quebec, demanding a blood price for choices made nearly a decade earlier. Rock Machine rises. While Maurice Boucher was cementing his rise inside the Hells Angels, his old ally Salvatore Cazzetta was busy forging an alternative vision. Outraged by the Lennoxville massacre, Cazzetta swore he would never ally himself with men capable of murdering their own. Instead, alongside his brother Giovanni, he founded the Rock Machine, a gang meant to stand outside the Angels' shadow and carve its own empire. The Rock Machine quickly established itself in Montreal, using bars, nightclubs, and strip joints as fronts for drug trafficking. Unlike the Angels, they were careful not to draw unnecessary attention. They cultivated a reputation for discipline, preferring business-like dealings to chaotic violence. That approach made them attractive allies to businessmen and independent dealers who feared the Angels' heavy hand. Soon, the Rock Machine became a sanctuary for those unwilling to surrender to Angel dominance. The Cazzetta brothers were more than just bikers, they were connected. Salvatore maintained strong ties to the Montreal Mafia, particularly with the Rizzuto crime family. This alliance offered protection and leverage, allowing the Rock Machine to grow without constant harassment. To many outsiders, the group looked less like a ragtag gang and more like a genuine criminal organization with vision and stability. This balance, however, was fragile. The Hells Angels tolerated the Rock Machine at first, calculating that coexistence was preferable to immediate war. Boucher, newly empowered within the Angels, watched closely. His respect for Cazzetta as a leader was genuine, but his ambitions left no room for rivals. The truce shattered in 1994 when Salvatore Cazzetta was arrested while attempting to import a massive cocaine shipment, over 440 pounds. With him behind bars, the rock machine lost its most respected leader. Leadership passed to Johnny Plescio and others, capable men but lacking the deep connections Cazzetta had maintained. For Boucher, this was the opening he'd been waiting for. He moved fast. Hell's Angels associates began approaching rock machine-controlled venues with an ultimatum: sell Angel-supplied drugs or watch your business burn. Some caved, unwilling to risk their lives. Others resisted, clinging to independence. Retaliation was swift: fires, bombings, and brazen attacks designed to send a message. The rock machine refused to bend. Instead, they rallied. Quiet meetings with street gangs, disaffected dealers, and even shady financiers gave birth to what became known as the Alliance. Together, they would resist Angel monopoly, pooling their strength against Boucher's growing empire. It was a bold move, but also a desperate one. Everyone involved knew the Angels had numbers, resources, and international support far beyond their own. Still, resistance was preferable to submission. For men who had grown up steeped in street pride, the idea of being absorbed was unthinkable. They would fight, no matter the cost. The rock machine's decision sealed Quebec's fate. What might have been resolved through backroom deals or quiet agreements instead became open war. And once the first shots were fired, there would be no turning back. The peaceful image of Quebec was about to be drowned beneath a tide of blood as two visions of criminal power collided, one rooted in independence, the other in total domination. The ultimatum. By 1994, Maurice Boucher's ambition had sharpened into a single, unshakable goal: total control of Quebec's drug trade. He was no longer satisfied with being just another player in a crowded field. For the Hells Angels to become the unrivaled kings of the underworld, every gram of cocaine, every pill, and every ounce of hash sold on the streets would have to pass through their hands. And Boucher was prepared to use fire and blood to make it happen. The ultimatum came with brutal clarity. Dealers, bar owners, and street gangs across Quebec were given two choices: buy their product from the Angels or be marked as enemies. There would be no middle ground. To enforce this decree, Boucher unleashed his lieutenants, hard men who carried out orders with chilling precision. Nightclubs that resisted were firebombed. Restaurants known to be allied with the rock machine were reduced to rubble. Those who dared to defy the ultimatum often didn't live to reconsider. Boucher's strategy wasn't just intimidation, it was spectacle. Each attack was meant to ripple through the underworld, sending a message not only to the immediate victims, but to everyone watching. Resistance is futile, police reports filled with bombings, shootings, and arsons, but the Angels' grip only tightened. Fear became their most effective weapon. For the rock machine, the ultimatum was a declaration of war. They were already struggling with the absence of Salvatore Cazzetta, now behind bars, but surrender was unthinkable. To them, giving in would mean annihilation. Johnny Plescio, one of their emerging leaders, rallied his men with the promise that they would not go quietly. They would stand their ground, no matter the cost. And so, the lines were drawn. On one side stood the Hells Angels, emboldened by Boucher's ruthless leadership and supported by their powerful allies in the Montreal Mafia. On the other side stood the rock machine and their network of gangs, businessmen, and street-level dealers unwilling to accept Angel domination. The alliance was fragile, held together by mutual survival rather than loyalty, but it gave the rock machine strength they could not muster alone. Quebec had never seen anything like what was coming. What had started as whispered threats and backroom deals now escalated into open violence. Bombs detonated in broad daylight, spraying shrapnel across residential neighborhoods. Bullets tore through the streets of Montreal, sometimes hitting intended targets, sometimes not. Children walked past burned-out cars on their way to school. Innocent lives became collateral damage in a war few outside the criminal underworld even understood. For police, the ultimatum created a nightmare. They were underfunded, undermanned, and in many cases compromised by corruption. Officers who tried to stand against the bikers were threatened, beaten, or bought. The system was paralyzed just as the streets were descending into chaos. The ultimatum had been delivered, and the consequences were already spiraling out of control. What remained to be seen was how far Boucher was willing to go to enforce his vision, and how much blood Quebec would have to spill before the message was finally clear. The alliance forms. Faced with the Hells Angels' ultimatum, the rock machine knew they couldn't survive alone. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and staring down an opponent backed by the wealth of international connections. Maurice Boucher wasn't bluffing. He intended to strangle every rival operation until nothing remained. The only chance of survival lay in unity. And so, in smoky backrooms and dimly lit bars, the resistance began to organize. The rock machine reached out to anyone with reason to resist. Independent drug dealers, local street gangs, and nightclub owners who feared losing their livelihoods all gathered at the table. Among them were two powerful groups that would give the resistance real weight: the Pelletier clan, a violent street gang with a reputation for ferocity, and the Dark Circle, a coalition of businessmen who operated quietly in the shadows of Montreal's drug economy. The deal was struck. They would form an alliance to counterbalance the Angels' overwhelming might. The Rock Machine and Pelletier clan would provide manpower, the soldiers in this war. The Dark Circle would provide money and influence, greasing wheels and supplying the cash flow needed to fund weapons, safe houses, and bribes. For the first time, the Hells Angels faced not just one rival gang, but a coalition determined to block their monopoly. To the public, nothing seemed unusual yet. The news reported scattered bombings and shootings, chalked up to gang violence. But behind the scenes, the alliance's formation was a declaration of war. Everyone involved understood the stakes. There would be no peace treaty, no coexistence. Either the Angels would crush the Alliance, or the Alliance would bleed the Angels until they retreated. The fragile unity wasn't without tension. Some members of the Alliance feared betrayal. After all, in the criminal underworld, today's ally could be tomorrow's executioner. The Dark Circle, with its shadowy businessmen, remained a mystery even to their partners. Their motives were profit, not pride, and loyalty to the Rock Machine was never guaranteed. Still, desperation bound them together. The Angels, for their part, recognized the challenge but didn't flinch. To Boucher, the alliance was proof of his own importance. If so many enemies were willing to set aside differences just to stop him, then he must have been doing something right. He welcomed the fight, confident that fear and firepower would eventually dismantle this coalition piece by piece. As 1994 turned to 1995, Montreal became a city on edge. Murders spiked, bombs rattled windows at night. The Alliance struck first blood in open defiance of Angel dominance, assassinating members and targeting Angel-controlled businesses. In retaliation, Boucher's lieutenants unleashed their own wave of attacks. Suddenly, everyday citizens found themselves walking through war zones disguised as neighborhoods. The Alliance had been formed out of necessity, but what it unleashed was chaos. Quebec's streets, once known for cafe chatter and late-night jazz, now echoed with gunfire. The biker war had begun in earnest, and no one, neither the Angels, the Alliance, nor the police, could control what was coming next. Day 1. Blood in Montreal. The summer of 1994 would go down as the moment when whispered threats turned into open bloodshed. On July 13th, 3 Rock Machine members walked into a Montreal motorcycle repair shop owned by a Hells Angels member. They didn't argue, didn't issue warnings. They simply opened fire, killing the man in his own business. Hours later, another Angel was shot, this time surviving only because he was rushed to the hospital in time. The message was unmistakable. The Rock Machine and their allies were ready to fight. The very next day, police foiled a bombing attempt targeting a Hells Angels clubhouse in South Shore. They arrested 5 Rock Machine members with explosives in their possession, preventing what could have been a massacre. But even the arrests did little to cool the tension. By then, the war had already begun. The Angels convened an emergency meeting at their Sherbrooke clubhouse. Boucher presided over a room filled with grim faces and hard men. There was no debate. Every chapter president voted in favor of war. The ultimatum had been answered, and now retaliation was inevitable. That very night, a Rock Machine member was gunned down in downtown Montreal. What followed set the pattern that would dominate Quebec for years. Violence answered with violence, bombs with bombs, murders with murders. The Rock Machine attacked Angel bars. The Angels struck back at Rock Machine businesses. The Pelletier clan prowled the streets, their reputation for brutality adding fuel to the fire. The Dark Circle provided funds, ensuring the Alliance's operations didn't grind to a halt. For ordinary Montrealers, the violence was impossible to ignore. Drive-by shootings lit up city streets. Bombs hidden in cars exploded outside nightclubs. Families stumbled onto crime scenes on their way to dinner. By the end of 1994, more than 20 people were dead. Many of them not even full members of either gang. Hangarounds, prospects, and unlucky associates caught in the crossfire. The police looked on, seemingly powerless. They couldn't infiltrate the gangs easily. Biker culture required years of trust building before someone could even get close to being a full-patch member. And even if they did manage to place informants, corruption inside the force often ensured their intelligence went nowhere. Quebec's justice system was riddled with leaks, bribes, and double dealing. For Boucher, the early days of war were a test. Could he enforce the Angels' will in the face of resistance? Could he bend the Alliance to its knees through fear and blood? His strategy was simple: escalate until the other side broke. For the Rock Machine, survival meant hitting back just as hard, proving they wouldn't be intimidated. By the close of the first year, Montreal was no longer just a city, it was a battlefield. And if anyone thought the violence would burn out quickly, they were gravely mistaken. The first shots were only the beginning of a war that would scar Quebec forever: bombs and betrayal. As the war dragged into 1995, the weapons escalated. Gunfire was no longer shocking, it had become routine. To send stronger messages, both sides turned to explosives. Montreal streets echoed with blasts as cars, bars, and homes were reduced to twisted wreckage. For residents, the smell of smoke and the sound of shattering glass became grim reminders that their city had been transformed into a war zone. Bombs carried a cruel advantage. They didn't just kill the intended target, they terrorized everyone nearby. And for the Hells Angels, spectacle was the point. Each detonation was designed to spread fear through rival gangs and civilians alike. Yet bombs were also unpredictable. They killed prospects, hang-arounds, girlfriends, even random bystanders who happened to walk by at the wrong moment. Quebec's once proud neighborhoods now bore the scars of a conflict few understood, but everyone felt. In this climate of chaos, betrayal became just as dangerous as bullets. Alliances forged in desperation began to fray under the strain of constant violence. The Dark Circle, those shadowy businessmen funding the Rock Machine, grew restless. For them, this wasn't about pride or brotherhood, it was about profit. As the war dragged on, profits fell and fear grew. Some began quietly negotiating with the Angels, slipping information across the line in exchange for survival. The Angels themselves weren't immune to paranoia. Maurice Boucher knew that corruption worked both ways. If he could bribe police officers, others could too. He suspected leaks within his own ranks and demanded absolute loyalty from his men. When doubts arose, the consequences were often fatal. Full-patch members who hesitated or disobeyed vanished, their bodies dumped in rivers or left as grisly warnings. Meanwhile, the Rock Machine found betrayal lurking in their own ranks. Some members, terrified by the Angels' sheer force, flipped sides. Others sold information to the police, hoping to save themselves if the Alliance collapsed. Every defection weakened morale and made trust nearly impossible. As one Rock Machine member later admitted, "We never knew if the man next to us would be alive tomorrow or if he'd be the one pulling the trigger on us." The paranoia wasn't unfounded. Police informants began feeding intelligence to the RCMP, and whispers spread of double agents embedded deep inside both organizations. Every raid, every foiled attack raised suspicions that someone was talking. Each gang hunted shadows, unsure who the real enemy was, the rival across the street or the brother at their side. For civilians, betrayal was just another layer of fear. Shopkeepers never knew if the young men drinking at their counters were loyal soldiers or marked men about to be targeted. Parents kept children inside, terrified that another bomb might explode on their block. The war was no longer just between bikers, it was seeping into the daily lives of ordinary Quebecers. By the end of 1995, the death toll had risen sharply, and the betrayals had left scars deeper than bomb craters. The war was no longer about territory alone, it was about survival. And as the paranoia grew, the violence would only spiral further, dragging everyone into its vortex. Police in the crosshairs. By 1996, Maurice Boucher no longer saw the police as neutral referees struggling to contain chaos. He saw them as enemies, obstacles to his dream of monopoly, meddlers who dared to pry into the affairs of the Hells Angels. And in a move that shocked even hardened criminals, he decided they should be treated like any rival gang, targets for elimination. The first strike came without warning. A prison guard waiting at a bus stop in downtown Montreal was gunned down in broad daylight. A month later, a prison transport van carrying inmates was ambushed, its windshield shredded with bullets. One guard was killed instantly, another gravely wounded. The message could not have been clearer: no badge, no uniform, no oath to the law would protect those who crossed the Angels. For Quebec, it was a nightmare. Police officers had always been symbols of order, the thin blue line holding back the tide of violence. Now, even they were vulnerable. Citizens wondered, if prison guards could be executed in broad daylight, who was safe? Fear trickled down from the highest levels of government to ordinary families who relied on those officers for protection. Boucher's plan was ruthless but calculated. By murdering officers of the justice system, he aimed to terrify not just law enforcement, but also prosecutors and judges. If investigators and juries feared for their lives, cases against the Angels might collapse before they even reached trial. He had seen how one informant's testimony, the infamous Eve Apache Trudeau, had decimated Angel leadership a decade earlier. Boucher was determined to ensure such betrayals could never succeed again. Inside police departments, morale collapsed. Whispers of corruption and double-dealing were already rampant, but now honest officers felt abandoned. Some refused assignments out of fear, others quietly accepted bribes just to stay off the hit list. Those who stood firm faced isolation from colleagues and harassment from criminals, emboldened by the Angels' audacity. One man refused to be cowed, Commander André Bouchard of the Montreal police. He had clashed with Boucher since the 1970s and despised him with a personal fury. Where others looked away, Bouchard leaned in, launching raids on Angel-controlled bars and strip clubs. In one infamous raid, he personally punched out a biker who tried to intimidate him, shouting to the room, "Anyone else want some?" His defiance became legendary, but it also painted a target on his back. Still, even Bouchard struggled against the tide. Political bickering between provincial authorities and federal agencies paralyzed investigations. Operation Wolverine, a task force designed to dismantle the Angels, became mired in infighting. Meanwhile, Boucher strutted into cafes in full colors, holding court with his lawyer and entourage, smirking as police glared helplessly across the room. By putting police in his crosshairs, Boucher had crossed a line few criminals dared. Yet far from weakening his power, it seemed to strengthen his legend. Crowds cheered him in public, seeing him as a folk hero defying a corrupt system. For his enemies, however, it was proof of something far more chilling. Maurice Boucher wasn't just fighting for the drug trade, he was waging war on the very idea of law itself. Danny Kane's double life. If the war in Quebec was defined by bombs, bullets, and brazen assassinations, it was also shaped by whispers. And few whispers were louder than those carried by Danny Kane, a man who lived two lives so convincingly that neither side truly grasped the depth of his duplicity until it was too late. Kane wasn't a full-patch Angel. Not yet. He belonged to the Rockers, a puppet club that did the Angels' dirty work. For years, he slaved for men like Walter Stadnick and David Carroll, ferrying drugs, running errands, dreaming that one day he'd wear the Sacred Death's head patch. But recognition never came. Instead, Kane was ordered to lead a doomed experiment, the Demon Keepers, a half-baked attempt to expand into Ontario. The plan failed spectacularly. Kane and his ragtag crew, mostly French-speaking outsiders, couldn't crack Ontario's criminal networks. Worse, their presence drew the full weight of the RCMP, who saw them as a serious invasion. Kane ended up behind bars, the Angels shrugged, and Stadnick moved on. That was when something inside Kane snapped. Used, discarded, and staring at years of wasted loyalty, he decided to flip the script. He approached the RCMP, not with hesitation, but with hunger. If the Angels wouldn't give him power, maybe the law would. And so began one of the most dangerous games of espionage in Canadian criminal history. To his handlers, Kane was a dream informant. He provided a roadmap to the inner sanctum of the Angels, sketching hierarchies, financial flows, and secret plans. He revealed that Boucher intended to form a shadowy elite unit, the Nomads, who would answer only to him, acting as both his enforcers and personal death squad. He detailed drug shipments, explained the club's ties to the Risotto Mafia, and even mapped which police officers were on Boucher's payroll. The money was good too. Kane received $2,000 a week, tax-free in cash, making him one of the highest-paid informants in Canada. But the danger was constant. By day, he was a loyal soldier, laughing and drinking alongside men who would kill him instantly if they suspected betrayal. By night, he was a shadow, slipping away to meet handlers, feeding them intelligence that would one day bring his brothers crashing down. But Kane was no saint. He lied to his handlers, exaggerating his role, pinning murders on others to save his own skin. He partied with prostitutes, sometimes calling his RCMP contacts mid-act, handing the phone over as proof of his escapades. To some, he looked less like a noble whistleblower and more like a reckless hustler milking both sides. Yet amid the bravado, his information was devastating. He confirmed suspicions about police corruption. He exposed Boucher's obsession with paranoia, his constant search for moles. And he painted a portrait of an empire rotting from within, held together by fear and violence rather than trust. Kane's duplicity escalated the war in ways he couldn't imagine. His tips led to drug busts that enraged Angels. His whispers deepened divisions inside the club as men eyed one another with suspicion. He became the hidden knife, cutting both ways, leaving scars on the Angels and the police alike. For Kane, the double life was intoxicating. But in a war where loyalty was currency and betrayal was death, the question wasn't if he'd pay the price, it was when. The death of innocents. Wars between outlaw bikers were expected to be bloody. Guns, bombs, ambushes. These were occupational hazards for men who lived by the patch. But in 1995, the Quebec Biker War crossed a line so shocking that even hardened criminals recoiled. For the first time, the carnage claimed not just rivals, but children. It happened on August 9, 1995. Marc Dubé, a mid-level drug dealer aligned with the Hells Angels, slid behind the wheel of his Jeep in Montreal. He had no idea a bomb had been hidden beneath his seat, its trigger waiting for the press of a button. As Dubé started the engine, a nearby Angel associate pressed the detonator. The explosion ripped through the street, shredding metal, shattering windows, and flinging debris in every direction. Dubé was killed instantly. But the true tragedy unfolded a few feet away. 11-year-old Daniel Desrochers was playing in a park across the street. A chunk of shrapnel from the blast struck him in the head. 4 days later, Daniel was dead. The murder of a child ignited outrage across Quebec. Headlines screamed of savagery. Politicians promised action. Ordinary citizens, already weary of shootings and firebombs, now demanded to know why their neighborhoods had become war zones. For many, Daniel's death was proof that the Angels and their enemies were no longer fighting each other. They were waging war on society itself. Inside the Angels, panic rippled. No one claimed responsibility, but whispers spread that Scott Steinert, Boucher's ruthless lieutenant, had ordered the bombing. Danny Kane later told police he overheard Steinert muttering about using bombs as psychological weapons, though after Daniel's death, he grew visibly nervous, muttering that the plan had gone too far. For the first time, even veteran killers began to wonder if their leaders had lost control. For Boucher, the fallout was complicated. On one hand, the killing of a child could have turned public opinion completely against the Angels. On the other, it provided him with an opportunity to manipulate perception. Rumors swirled that he wanted the rock machine blamed, painting them as reckless monsters, even though his own men had likely carried out the bombing. The murky fog of war made it impossible to pin the crime on any one group, and that ambiguity was exactly what Boucher thrived on. But outside the gang world, there was no ambiguity. Parents were terrified. Schools increased security. Neighbors whispered about moving away. The line between combatants and civilians had blurred, and for the people of Quebec, the biker war was no longer background noise. It was a daily creeping dread. For the first time, the Canadian public demanded that law enforcement act decisively. Yet corruption, infighting, and politics continued to hobble investigations. Citizens wondered whether the system could even protect them. Meanwhile, the Angels and Rock Machine kept bombing, kept shooting, kept burning businesses to ash. Daniel Desrochers' death became a haunting symbol of the war's cruelty, a reminder that in battles fueled by greed and ambition, it is always the innocent who bleed the most. Trials, acquittals, and public outrage. The death of Daniel Desrochers was a turning point for Quebec. Citizens wanted blood, not on the streets, but in the courts. And so, in December 1997, police finally moved against Maurice Boucher. He was arrested and charged with ordering the murders of 2 prison guards, along with attempted murder of a third. For many, this was the moment they had waited for, the trial that would finally clip the Angels' wings. But when the trial opened in 1998, something strange happened. The courthouse itself seemed to bend in Boucher's favor. Jurors noticed rows of Angels sitting in the gallery, dressed in full colors, staring coldly from the front row. The intimidation was so obvious, it became a spectacle in its own right. Then came the judge, Jean-Guy Boilard. He was feared across Quebec for his iron hand in previous gang cases. But when it came to Boucher, his rulings leaned heavily toward the defense. Motions that would normally be dismissed were accepted. Key pieces of evidence were deemed inadmissible. Testimony that prosecutors believed was crucial was struck from the record. It was as if invisible weights were shifting the scales of justice. Outside, public anger boiled. The murders of prison guards had been audacious enough, symbols of the justice system gunned down in cold blood. Now, the possibility of Boucher walking free felt like a slap in the face. The press covered every moment of the trial, portraying it not just as a legal battle, but as a test of whether Quebec's institutions could withstand the Angels' influence. In May 1998, the unthinkable happened. Boucher was acquitted on all charges. To his supporters, it was vindication, proof that he could outwit the state. To his enemies, it was corruption made visible. Journalists openly accused the jury of being intimidated. Politicians demanded answers. The streets buzzed with disbelief. Boucher, ever the showman, leaned into his newfound myth. He strutted into public spaces in full angel colors, soaking in the attention. At a boxing match in Montreal, witnesses described the crowd rising as one to cheer him, as though he were a celebrity rather than an accused murderer. Commander Maurice Boucher, hardened by decades of fighting bikers, sat in the stands that night and later admitted the ovation broke his heart. The acquittal cemented Boucher's image as untouchable. He was no longer just a gangster. He was a folk hero in the eyes of many disillusioned with the police and government. He represented rebellion, power, and the defiance of authority. For some in Montreal, he wasn't the villain, he was the anti-hero. But beneath the swagger, cracks were forming. Prosecutors appealed, arguing that the jury had been improperly influenced. Investigators quietly gathered more evidence, biding their time. And inside the Angels, paranoia deepened. Informants were suspected, loyalty was questioned. Even Boucher, seemingly untouchable, began to realize that the shadow of justice had not disappeared. It was only circling, waiting for its chance to strike again. The aftermath and legacy. By the early 2000s, the war that had drenched Quebec in blood was finally grinding to a halt. The rock machine, battered by years of bombings and assassinations, eventually splintered. Some of its members patched over to larger international clubs like the Bandidos, while others simply faded away. The Angels, meanwhile, stood victorious, their monopoly over Quebec's drug trade largely secured. But it was a hollow victory, one bought at the price of over 160 lives, hundreds of injuries, 84 bombings, and a generation of fear that hung over Montreal like a storm cloud. The public's outrage did not vanish with the violence. Daniel Desrochers' death remained a national scar, a symbol of how deeply the war had invaded civilian life. Journalists, judges, and police officers who had been threatened or attacked carried those memories long after the guns fell silent. For families who lost loved ones, whether they were bikers, bystanders, or officers, there was no closure, only unanswered questions about why the war had been allowed to rage so long. Law enforcement, humiliated for years by corruption and ineffectiveness, finally pushed for stronger tools. Inspired by the US RICO laws, Canada introduced tougher anti-gang legislation in 1997 and expanded it further in the 2000s. The biker war, for all its destruction, forced a reckoning that reshaped Canadian criminal justice. No longer would outlaw motorcycle clubs be dismissed as rowdy misfits. They were recognized as sophisticated organized crime groups, and the law began treating them as such. But even with new laws, the scars remained. Montrealers remembered the constant fear, avoiding certain streets, steering clear of biker bars, worrying that the next bomb might take them or their children. The Angels' image, once cloaked in rebellious mystique, had hardened into something darker. An empire of greed and blood, willing to sacrifice anyone, even innocents, in the name of control. For Maurice Boucher, the end was personal. Convicted and locked in a maximum security prison, expelled from the Angels and targeted by enemies behind bars, his fall from folk hero to forgotten relic was complete. His ambition had built the war, his ambition had destroyed him. Yet the violence he unleashed had already reshaped Quebec forever. And so the story of the Quebec Biker War is not just about gangsters and drugs. It is about what happens when one man's lust for power collides with a fragile society. It is about how corruption, intimidation, and violence can choke a city until even children pay the price. And it is about the chilling truth that for nearly a decade, the streets of a modern, prosperous city became the battlefield for the most feared biker war in the world. Even today, the echoes remain. The Angels still ride, rival gangs still exist. But the ghosts of Quebec's war, the bombed cafes, the assassinated guards, the murdered children, linger as reminders of a time when ambition turned a city into a war zone and left scars that no one has ever truly healed. Meet Armon Bletcher, the scariest Hell's Angel most people never heard of. Standing 6 feet 8 inches and weighing a massive 350 pounds, this human mountain didn't need guns or weapons to terrify his enemies. Even baseball bats bounced off him like toys. His massive fists could crush bones, and legendary biker Sonny Barger once said he'd rather have Armon by his side than 10 other Angels combined. Discover how this towering enforcer became a terrifying legend before meeting his shocking end. Man Mountain. When Armon Bletcher walked into a room, everything seemed to shrink around him. At 6 feet 8 inches tall and weighing a massive 350 pounds, he wasn't just big. He was a human mountain. People who met him never forgot the experience. His shoulders were so wide he had to turn sideways to get through some doorways. His hands were like baseball mitts, capable of completely wrapping around a man's arm with fingers to spare. But Armon wasn't born this way. As a kid growing up in California in the 1950s, he was actually picked on by bullies. Hard to believe when you picture what he became. The story goes that young Armon got fed up with being pushed around and decided to transform himself. He hit the gym with an obsession that bordered on madness. Day after day, he pumped iron until his muscles screamed. While other guys might work out to look good at the beach, Armon trained like his life depended on it. And according to biker legends, he didn't stop at just working out. Whispers followed him that he used horse steroids to pack on even more size, though nobody ever dared ask him about it to his face. By the time he patched in with the Hells Angels in the late 1960s, he was already becoming a legend. Other bikers would point him out at rallies, and newbies couldn't believe their eyes. "That can't be real," they'd say. But he was real all right, and the sight of him climbing off his chopper, which looked like a kid's toy beneath him, was enough to make even the toughest guys nervous. Sonny Barger, the famous leader of the Hells Angels, once said that if he had to go into battle, he'd rather have just Armon by his side than 10 other angels. That wasn't just talk. Armon's size was so intimidating that many fights never even started. One look at the giant angel cracking his knuckles was usually enough to make potential troublemakers suddenly remember they had somewhere else to be. No guns needed. While most outlaw bikers packed heat, Armon Bletcher was known for something unusual in the violent biker world of the 1970s. He rarely carried weapons. With fists the size of Christmas hams, why would he need to? "Guns are for guys who can't handle their business," he reportedly once said to a prospect who was showing off a new pistol. The young biker quickly tucked the gun away, lesson learned. When trouble broke out at bars where Armon worked as a bouncer, he didn't reach for a weapon, he simply waded in. One famous story tells how 3 drunk truckers started causing problems, throwing bottles and threatening the bartender. Armon simply picked up the first guy one-handed by his collar, carried him to the door like a misbehaving puppy, and tossed him into the parking lot. The other 2 troublemakers took one look and followed their buddy out without a word. What made Armon truly terrifying wasn't just his size, it was his seeming immunity to pain. A rival gang member once claimed he hit Armon multiple times with a baseball bat during a bar brawl, only to watch in horror as the giant barely flinched before grabbing him by the throat. "It was like hitting a redwood tree," the man supposedly said later. As a bouncer and bodyguard, Armon's reputation grew beyond the biker world. Hollywood stars and musicians wanted the imposing figure by their side. Frank Sinatra reportedly hired him as personal protection during a West Coast tour, and the two became unlikely friends. The contrast between the 5'7" crooner and his mountain-sized bodyguard made quite the impression at exclusive clubs and restaurants. Armon's no-guns policy wasn't about being peaceful. He was still involved in plenty of violence, according to police records. But there was something almost old-school about his approach. In a world where anyone could pull a trigger, Armon believed in the power of his fists. And for many years, they were all he needed to stay on top of the dangerous world he called home. Bulletproof beast. If you asked anyone who ran into Armon Bletcher back in the 70s, they'd tell you he wasn't a normal human being. Sure, his massive 6 feet 8 inches frame and 350 pounds of muscle were impressive enough, but there was something else about him. Something that made people whisper that he might actually be bulletproof. Of course, he wasn't really bulletproof. The 3 bullets that ended his life at age 33 proved that. But for years, the stories about his ability to shrug off punishment that would drop any normal man made him seem almost superhuman. Take the infamous Oakland bar fight of 1972. According to biker law, Armon was enjoying a quiet beer when 4 members of a rival club decided to jump him. Bad idea. One guy smashed a beer bottle over Armon's head. The bottle shattered, beer went everywhere, and Armon just turned around slowly, wiped the beer from his eyes, and smiled. That smile, witnesses said, was scarier than any threat. Within minutes, all 4 attackers were laid out on the floor, and Armon went back to his beer like nothing had happened. When the police showed up, they found Armon with barely a scratch while his opponents needed ambulances. Then there was the legendary baseball bat incident. This one got told and retold so many times around biker campfires that it's hard to separate fact from fiction. But the basic story goes like this. During a territory dispute with another gang, someone took a Louisville slugger to Armon's back. The wooden bat literally splintered on impact. Armon turned around, grabbed the guy by his jacket, and sent him flying across the room with one punch. The attacker had been a college baseball player. He hit Armon with everything he had. Might as well have been swinging a toothpick at a grizzly bear. How did Armon do it? Some said it was the steroids he allegedly used. Others pointed to his unnatural pain tolerance. A few even claimed he practiced some kind of Eastern meditation that allowed him to block out pain. The truth was probably more straightforward, a combination of adrenaline, alcohol, and an absolutely massive frame that could absorb punishment that would flatten smaller men. Armon's reputation for being bulletproof spread far beyond biker circles. Bouncers at clubs throughout California told stories about him. One night at a San Francisco nightclub, a drunk with a knife thought he could take on the giant doorman. According to witnesses, Armon let the guy cut him on the arm, a long, shallow slice, just to prove a point. While blood dripped down his massive forearm, Armon never broke eye contact with the knife wielder. He then calmly reached out, took the knife away, and bent the blade in half before tossing it aside. This seemingly supernatural resistance to pain earned Armon the nickname The Beast among those who feared him most. Police reports from his numerous arrests often noted his unusual calmness, even when injured or in handcuffs. One Fresno officer wrote in a report that the suspect had visible injuries but showed no signs of discomfort or distress. He refused medical attention, stating he didn't believe in doctors. His fellow Hell's Angels used his reputation to their advantage. When collecting debts or intimidating rivals, they'd bring Armon along and share stories of his indestructibility. By the mid-70s, just the rumor that Armon might show up was enough to make people pay up or back down. A former club member who knew Armon shared a telling story years later. They were at a roadhouse out near Bakersfield, and some local tough guys decided to start trouble. One of them had brass knuckles and caught Armon right in the jaw. Now, brass knuckles will drop most anybody, right? But Armon just stood there, worked his jaw back and forth a couple times, and said it tickled. The troublemakers cleared out of the bar faster than anyone had ever seen. What made Armon even more intimidating was that he seemed to enjoy pain, or at least he never showed any fear of it. While other bikers would brag about their wounds and scars, Armon acted like his were nothing special. A broken finger? He'd just tape it up himself and keep going. A knife wound? Just another day at the office. This attitude extended to his famous bar fights. While most brawlers try to avoid getting hit, Armon sometimes intentionally took a punch or two just to show his opponents how little effect they had. It was psychological warfare at its most primitive, and it worked. A bartender from a Fresno dive bar recalled seeing Armon let a guy punch him square in the stomach once. This was a big dude too, a former boxer. He hit Armon with everything he had. Armon just laughed and asked if that was all he got. The guy practically ran out of the bar. Stories about Armon's toughness weren't limited to fights. Fellow bikers swore he could drink amounts of alcohol that would put normal men in the hospital. One tale claims he drank an entire bottle of whiskey in one go during an initiation ritual, then rode his motorcycle 100 miles without showing any signs of being drunk. His pain resistance wasn't just for show, it had practical benefits in the biker world. In a culture where showing weakness could be deadly, Armon's ability to shrug off injuries gave him a massive advantage. Other bikers knew that hurting him wouldn't slow him down, it would just make him mad. Armon's reputation was so strong that some Hell's Angels chapters would borrow him from his Fresno base when they needed extra muscle for particularly dangerous situations. He became something of a troubleshooter for the club, showing up when tensions were highest and the risk of violence was greatest. His appearance alone was often enough to prevent bloodshed. Rival gangs would take one look at the giant angel and decide that whatever the dispute was about, it wasn't worth facing him. This earned Armon a strange respect even among enemies of the Hell's Angels, who viewed him as something like a force of nature, not evil, just unstoppable. Law enforcement agencies had their own files on Armon, with one police detective describing him as impervious to standard compliance techniques. This was cop speak for saying that pepper spray, batons, and even tasers seemed to have minimal effect on him. It typically took multiple officers to restrain him during his numerous arrests. But perhaps the most impressive testament to Armon's toughness wasn't from a fight at all. During a motorcycle accident in 1974, he was thrown from his bike at high speed, breaking several ribs and fracturing his arm. Witnesses expected to find a dead or at least unconscious man. Instead, they found Armon trying to lift his 700-pound chopper by himself, concerned more about damage to his bike than his own injuries. When paramedics arrived, he refused treatment and somehow managed to ride his damaged motorcycle home, one-handed with broken ribs. He didn't visit a hospital. Instead, a club member who had some medical training wrapped his ribs, set his arm in a homemade cast, and Armon was back at the clubhouse bar that same night. Of course, no human is truly bulletproof, and Armon's seeming invincibility likely drove him to take risks that eventually caught up with him. His belief in his own indestructibility might explain why he reportedly walked into that fateful confrontation with his cousins unarmed, never expecting that the day would end with him bleeding out on the floor of their tire shop. The legend of the bulletproof beast lives on in biker folklore, growing with each retelling. Some stories claim he once caught a bullet with his teeth, or that knives would bend on contact with his skin. Pure fiction, of course, but the truth, a mountain of a man with an unnatural tolerance for pain and a complete disregard for his own safety, was frightening enough without embellishment. In the end, Armon Bletcher wasn't bulletproof at all. He was just a man, albeit an extraordinarily large and tough one, who created such an intimidating presence that the stories about him took on a life of their own. But for a few brief years in the 1970s, if you were in a California bar and saw this giant walk through the door, you might have believed the legends yourself. Star Protector. In the glitzy world of 1970s, Hollywood and Las Vegas, celebrities needed protection. Not just from overeager fans wanting autographs, but from real dangers, stalkers, kidnapping threats, and organized crime. While most stars hired ex-cops or military men in neat suits, Frank Sinatra made a different choice. For a period in the early 1970s, the legendary singer reportedly had the most intimidating bodyguard in the business, Armon Bletcher, the 6'8", 350-pound Hells Angels enforcer known as the Beast. The unlikely partnership between the refined entertainment icon and the massive outlaw biker began, according to insider stories, after an incident at a Las Vegas casino. Sinatra, no stranger to mob connections himself, had supposedly been having trouble with some unwanted characters making threats. His usual security detail wasn't cutting it. That's when someone suggested bringing in the biggest, scariest man in California, Armon Bletcher. The visual contrast alone made people stop and stare. Sinatra, the elegant crooner standing barely 5 feet 7 inches in his custom Italian shoes, walking alongside a mountain of a man whose shoulders were wider than most doorways. Photographers loved catching glimpses of the odd pair, though they learned quickly to keep their distance. Armon didn't appreciate flashbulbs going off in his face, and cameras had a tendency to accidentally break when pointed in his direction. For Sinatra, having Bletcher around solved problems before they started. The singer had a famous temper and occasionally got into situations that required muscle to resolve. With Armon looming behind him, those situations simply evaporated. Nobody wanted to test whether the rumors about the Hells Angels' strength and pain tolerance were true. Hotel staff from Vegas to Palm Springs remembered the giant biker standing silently in corners during Sinatra's performances, scanning the crowd with cold eyes. Waiters recalled having to look up, way up, to take his drink orders, always non-alcoholic when he was working. Armon might have been a heavy drinker in his off hours, but on protection duty, he stayed completely sober and alert. The arrangement worked well for both men. Sinatra got the ultimate deterrent against trouble, and Armon got a legitimate paycheck plus access to a world most outlaw bikers never saw. The Hells Angel moved easily between two worlds, the glittering high life of celebrities and the gritty reality of outlaw motorcycle clubs. This dual existence added to his mystique. Armon's protection duties went beyond just standing around looking intimidating. He would scout locations before Sinatra arrived, checking for security weaknesses and potential problems. He would position himself strategically during public appearances, always keeping his eyes moving. And he developed a sixth sense for spotting trouble in a crowd, a skill honed during years of bar fights and biker brawls. His methods weren't always gentle. One story from a Las Vegas hotel worker described seeing Armon deal with a persistent autograph seeker who wouldn't take no for an answer. The massive biker didn't punch the man or create a scene. Instead, he simply placed one enormous hand on the fan's shoulder and steered him firmly toward the exit. The grip was tight enough to make the message clear without leaving bruises. The man left quickly, looking pale. Beyond Sinatra, rumors swirled about other celebrities who hired Armon for protection. Various Hollywood stars, rock musicians, and even a famous boxer supposedly used his services when they needed extra security. Each industry had its own stories about the giant biker who could clear a path through any crowd just by walking forward. For celebrities with edgier reputations, having a Hells Angel as protection added to their outlaw image. Rock stars particularly appreciated how Armon's presence kept record executives and unwanted groupies at a safe distance. His intimidation factor worked on everyone from teenage fans to suited businessmen. What made Armon different from other bodyguards wasn't just his size, it was his background. Most security professionals came from law enforcement or military backgrounds. They knew rules and procedures. Armon came from a world where violence wasn't just a possibility, but an everyday reality. His approach to protection came from experience, not training manuals. This difference showed in how he handled potential threats. Professional bodyguards were taught to evacuate their clients from dangerous situations. Armon's instinct was to eliminate the threat entirely. Several times, according to Vegas insiders, Sinatra had to specifically order him not to hurt someone who had crossed a line. The singer reportedly appreciated the loyalty, but didn't want excessive violence associated with his name. The entertainment industry gossip columns occasionally hinted at Armon's presence in Sinatra's entourage, usually describing him only as a large associate or personal security. The Hells Angels connection was rarely mentioned in print, partly because Armon himself avoided publicity, and partly because Sinatra's team worked to keep it quiet. Nevertheless, industry insiders knew exactly who the giant man in the corner was. His reputation spread through Hollywood whisper networks, with stories growing more outlandish with each telling. Some claimed he had once carried an unconscious Sinatra through a kitchen fire after a club explosion. Others insisted he had thrown a stalker off a second-story balcony into a swimming pool. Most of these tales were certainly exaggerated, but they added to the mystique surrounding the unlikely bodyguard. Armon's duties sometimes extended beyond just physical protection. He reportedly drove Sinatra to private meetings where the singer didn't want his regular entourage present. He delivered messages too sensitive for phones, and he stood watch outside hotel rooms during meetings that never appeared in any official schedule. The full extent of his service to Sinatra may never be known, but it clearly went beyond simple security work. The relationship wasn't just professional. According to those who knew both men, Sinatra actually liked having Armon around. The singer had always been fascinated by tough guys with colorful backgrounds, and Armon certainly qualified. They weren't friends exactly, their worlds were too different for that, but there was mutual respect. Sinatra appreciated loyalty and straightforwardness, qualities Armon had in abundance. For his part, Armon never bragged about his celebrity connections back at the Hells Angels clubhouse. When asked about rumors that he worked for Sinatra, he would typically shrug them off or change the subject. The code of the outlaw biker didn't include name-dropping about famous clients, no matter how impressive they might be. The arrangement eventually ended, though stories differ on exactly why. Some say Sinatra's regular security team felt undermined by the biker's presence. Others claim Armon's increasingly complicated legal issues made him too much of a liability for a public figure like Sinatra. Whatever the reason, the giant Hells Angel eventually returned to his primary world of motorcycle clubs and bar bouncing. But the legend of the Star Protector lived on in Hollywood. Even decades later, security professionals in the entertainment industry would reference Armon's time with Sinatra as the gold standard of intimidation. Nobody who saw the giant biker standing guard ever forgot him, or dared to cause trouble while he was watching. The unlikely partnership between one of America's most beloved entertainers and one of its most feared bikers remains a fascinating footnote in celebrity history. It shows how even stars who lived in the spotlight sometimes needed help from men who operated in the shadows. And for a brief time in the 1970s, the biggest shadow of all belonged to Armon Bletcher, the Hells Angel who protected the stars. Sonny's seal of approval. When it comes to the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, one name stands above all others in terms of respect and authority: Ralph "Sonny" Barger. As the founder of the Oakland chapter and longtime national president, Barger's opinion carried more weight than almost anyone else in the outlaw biker world. When Sonny Barger spoke, Hells Angels listened, and when it came to Armon Bletcher, Barger didn't just speak, he raved. According to biker law, Barger once made a statement that cemented Bletcher's reputation forever. When asked who he'd want by his side in a serious situation, Barger reportedly said he'd rather have just Armon than 10 other Hells Angels combined. Coming from a man who had hundreds of tough bikers at his disposal, this was the ultimate endorsement. Barger first met Bletcher in the late 1960s when the giant was still a prospect, working to earn his full patch with the Fresno chapter. Even then, before he reached his full physical prime, Bletcher stood out. Not just because of his height and build, but because of his unusual approach to conflict. While many prospects tried to prove themselves through wild, uncontrolled aggression, Bletcher was notably calm and calculated. He didn't waste energy on unnecessary movements or threats. When action was needed, he simply acted. This efficiency impressed Barger, who had seen countless tough guys come and go over the years. The Hells Angels leader had a military background, having served in the army, and he appreciated discipline even within the chaotic world of outlaw bikers. Bletcher's methodical approach to violence, combined with his extraordinary physical gifts, made him stand out from the typical muscle. By the early 1970s, when Bletcher had earned his full colors and established his fearsome reputation, Barger would occasionally borrow him from the Fresno chapter for situations that required special handling. While the details of these missions remained shrouded in biker secrecy, their results would often be evident. Problems that had been brewing suddenly disappeared, rival gangs backed down and disputes were settled with surprising speed. In his memoir, Barger briefly mentioned Bletcher without using his full name, referring to him only as the big man from Fresno, a nod to both his physical stature and his importance within the club. Barger described watching Bletcher load 2 motorcycles into a truck by himself, lifting each bike as if it were a bicycle rather than a 700-pound machine. The story was written with clear admiration, rare for a man who was notoriously sparing with his praise. This approval from the top of the Hells Angels hierarchy gave Bletcher a special status within the club. While he never held an official leadership position, he wasn't cut out for the politics and planning that came with being an officer. He enjoyed a level of respect typically reserved for chapter presidents and longtime members. Even angels from other chapters, who might normally look down on a relatively new member, treated Bletcher with cautious respect when he was around. Barger's endorsement wasn't just about Bletcher's fighting ability. The Hells Angels president valued loyalty above almost everything else, and Bletcher had proven himself unfailingly loyal to the club. Unlike some members who put their own interests first, Bletcher always prioritized the Angels. He never talked to law enforcement, never complained about taking the dangerous assignments, and never tried to leverage his reputation for personal gain. This loyalty extended to Barger personally. On multiple occasions when tensions arose within the club, inevitable in an organization filled with strong personalities and volatile tempers, Bletcher firmly aligned himself with Barger's faction. This wasn't blind following. Bletcher simply recognized Barger's leadership as beneficial for the club as a whole. Having the biggest, most intimidating member firmly in your corner was a significant advantage for Barger in maintaining his position. The relationship between the two men wasn't exactly friendship in the traditional sense. They were too different for that. Barger was calculating, politically savvy, and media conscious, carefully crafting the Hells Angels' public image, even while engaging in activities he knew were better kept private. Bletcher was straightforward, uninterested in publicity, and focused entirely on the present moment rather than long-term strategy. But despite these differences, they shared a mutual respect based on recognition of each other's unique qualities. At club gatherings, observers noted how Barger would often position Bletcher near him, not just as protection, but as a visible symbol of the power at his disposal. In group photos from the era, Bletcher typically stands slightly behind Barger, towering over everyone else, his size making the club president's security clear without a word needing to be said. This visual association benefited both men. For Barger, having the club's most physically imposing member as a clear ally reinforced his leadership. For Bletcher, the close association with Barger gave him a status within the club that his relatively short tenure might not otherwise have earned him. It was a mutually beneficial arrangement that worked on multiple levels. Barger's appreciation for Bletcher went beyond just his fighting ability. According to those familiar with both men, Barger particularly valued Bletcher's self-control. Despite his fearsome reputation and capabilities, Bletcher rarely initiated violence without clear purpose. He wasn't a loose cannon who might create problems for the club through impulsive actions. In an organization where hot-headed behavior could bring unwanted police attention, Bletcher's restraint was as valuable as his strength. This restraint showed itself in how Bletcher handled police interactions as well. While many Hells Angels automatically antagonized law enforcement, Bletcher was known to remain calm during arrests and questioning. He never cooperated, maintaining the club's code of silence, but he also didn't make situations worse through resistance or threats. Barger, always concerned about the club's legal vulnerabilities, appreciated this approach. When Bletcher died in 1975, allegedly shot by his own cousins during a dispute, Barger made sure the Fresno chapter gave him a proper Hells Angels funeral. The event drew members from chapters across California and beyond, a testament to how widely Bletcher's reputation had spread. Barger himself attended, an honor not given to every fallen angel. Years later, when asked about memorable members who had passed through the club's ranks, Barger would occasionally mention Bletcher, usually with a slight shake of his head, as if still amazed by the man's physical capabilities. For someone who had seen thousands of tough men come and go over decades, this lasting impression spoke volumes about Bletcher's impact. Barger's seal of approval helped transform Bletcher from merely a physically imposing member into a Hells Angels legend. Without this endorsement from the top, Bletcher might have been remembered simply as a big guy who could fight. With it, he became something more, a symbol of the ideal angel in many ways. Loyal, effective, intimidating, and dedicated to the club above all else. Even decades after both men were gone from the scene, Bletcher through death and Barger through retirement and eventually his own passing, old Hells Angels would still tell stories about the giant who had Sonny's special approval. In a culture where reputation is everything, having the respect of the most respected member created a legacy that outlived the man himself. The legend of Armon Bletcher, already substantial based on his size and fighting ability, was elevated to mythic status largely because the most important figure in Hell's Angels history decided this one was special. Sonny Barger had seen it all, done it all, and known everyone worth knowing in the outlaw biker world. If he said Bletcher was one in a million, who would dare argue? From bullied to bully. The story of Armon Bletcher begins like many tales of men who later become infamous for their toughness, with a skinny kid who was pushed around too many times. Before he became the mountain of muscle that terrorized California's underworld, young Armon was just another target for schoolyard tormentors in 1950s Alameda County. Born in 1942 to Edward Bletcher, a Navy veteran who served in 3 wars, Armon started life with a strong example of masculinity in his home. His father had survived combat in World War II Korea and later Vietnam, a man who understood violence and discipline. But while Edward Bletcher was tough, his son initially was not. The early school photos that still exist show a surprisingly average boy, not particularly small, but certainly nothing like the giant he would become. With dark hair and a serious expression, young Armon blended into class pictures, just another post-war kid in a time when America was booming and suburban life was taking shape. But something was happening to Armon that didn't show in those formal school portraits. According to childhood acquaintances who later spoke about him, Armon was a frequent target for bullies. The exact reasons aren't clear. Perhaps he was quiet or awkward, or simply unlucky enough to catch the attention of the wrong kids. Whatever the cause, the effect was clear. Repeated humiliation at the hands of stronger boys. This pattern continued into his early teens. While many kids who suffer bullying find ways to cope, making friends in other circles, excelling at academics, or simply enduring until graduation, Armon apparently chose a different path. Somewhere around age 15, according to those who knew him, he made a decision that would alter the course of his life. He would never be weak again. His transformation began with basic weightlifting. In the 1950s, bodybuilding was nowhere near as common as it is today. Information was limited to a few magazines, and whatever wisdom could be found at local gyms. Equipment was primitive by modern standards, but Armon attacked his new hobby with an intensity that surprised everyone who knew him. While other teenagers were going to dances or playing sports, Armon was lifting weights in his garage. He started with a simple barbell set, adding more plates as his strength increased. His father, recognizing something of himself in his son's determination, supported this interest. After all, physical strength was something a military man could understand and appreciate. Within a year, the changes were noticeable. The formerly average teenager had put on muscle, broadened his shoulders, and grown several inches taller. By 17, he was already standing out in a crowd. But this was just the beginning of his physical transformation. After high school, when many of his classmates went to college or took local jobs, Armon intensified his bodybuilding regimen. Now lifting at a real gym in Oakland, he absorbed knowledge from older bodybuilders and weightlifters. He changed his diet, eating massive amounts of protein. He trained for hours each day, pushing beyond normal limits of endurance. And then, according to persistent rumors that followed him throughout his life, he crossed a line that many serious bodybuilders of that era faced. He began using steroids. In the early 1960s, performance-enhancing drugs were not yet illegal, though they weren't widely available either. The exact substances Armon allegedly used are unclear in the stories. Some accounts mention horse steroids typically used for livestock. Others reference military-grade performance enhancers his father might have helped him obtain. Whatever the truth of these rumors, the results were undeniable. By his early 20s, Armon Bletcher had transformed himself from an ordinary young man into something extraordinary. Standing over 6 feet 8 inches tall and weighing well over 300 pounds, he was now the one who caused fear in others. The psychological transformation matched the physical one. The formerly bullied boy developed a presence that commanded respect, or at least caution, from everyone he encountered. His voice deepened to a rumbling bass. His posture became imposing. He learned to use his size to intimidate without even needing to make threats. This new identity needed a suitable environment, and Armon found it in the emerging outlaw motorcycle culture of 1960s California. The Hells Angels and similar clubs valued exactly what Armon now embodied: physical power, intimidation, and a willingness to use violence. When he began hanging around the Fresno chapter, they immediately recognized his potential. The irony of his situation was probably not lost on Armon. The very qualities that had made him a target as a boy, being different, standing out from the crowd, now made him valuable in his new world. His enormous size, once a source of mockery, had become his greatest asset. As he rose within the Hells Angels hierarchy, Armon developed a reputation for particular cruelty toward those he perceived as bullies. Bar owners who mistreated their staff, men who abused women, or anyone who picked on those weaker than themselves could expect special attention from Bletcher if they crossed his path. This wasn't justice in any formal sense, it was personal, a reflection of his own history. Several accounts describe incidents where Armon intervened when seeing smaller men harassed by groups. One bartender recalled how Bletcher spotted 3 drunk construction workers cornering a much smaller man outside a Fresno bar. Without hesitation, he walked over, physically separated the group, and made it clear that the harassment was over. When one of the construction workers objected, Armon reportedly picked him up by his collar and belt and deposited him in a dumpster. Yet even as he protected some from bullying, Armon had become something of a bully himself. His intimidation tactics weren't limited to defending the innocent. As an enforcer for the Hells Angels, he used his size and strength to collect debts, pressure rivals, and maintain the club's territory. The line between protection and extortion often blurred in the outlaw biker world. By the mid-1970s, when Armon was at the height of his power within the Hells Angels, few would have guessed his origins as a bullied teenager. The massive enforcer seemed like he had always been intimidating, always been powerful. The skinny kid from Alameda County existed only in fading photographs and the memories of those who had known him before. The ultimate tragedy of Armon Bletcher's transformation was that it may have contributed to his death. The overwhelming confidence in his own physical power, the belief that he could intimidate anyone into backing down, likely led him to walk unarmed into his final confrontation with his cousins. For all his size and strength, bullets don't discriminate between the weak and the powerful. In the end, the bullied boy who became a feared enforcer discovered the limits of physical intimidation. All the muscles in the world couldn't stop the 3 bullets that ended his life at age 33. But his legend lives on, a cautionary tale about how trauma can shape a life, how victims sometimes become perpetrators, and how the search for power can lead down dangerous paths. Motorcycle muscle. When most Hells Angels struggled to handle their heavyweight motorcycles, Armon Bletcher made them look like toys. Standing at 6 feet 8 inches and weighing over 350 pounds of solid muscle, his strength wasn't just for show. It was practical in the biker world where heavy machines often needed to be lifted, pushed, or hauled. The story that cemented his reputation for superhuman strength came from none other than Sonny Barger himself. In his memoir, Barger described watching Bletcher single-handedly load 2 Harley-Davidson motorcycles into the back of a pickup truck. For anyone familiar with motorcycles, this feat seems almost impossible. A typical Harley from that era weighed between 600 and 700 pounds. Most men couldn't even push one up a ramp without help, let alone lift it bodily into a truck bed. Bletcher's own motorcycle was customized to accommodate his enormous frame. The handlebars were set wider than standard, the seat was reinforced with extra supports, and the suspension was beefed up to handle his weight. Even with these modifications, he still looked comically large on the bike, his knees sticking out to the sides, his massive boots nearly dragging on the ground at stops. The sight of him on his chopper became legendary among California bikers. People would stare in amazement as he thundered past, the motorcycle seeming to strain under his bulk, yet still roaring along at high speed. Some said the ground shook when Bletcher rode by, an exaggeration surely, but one that captured the impressive image he created. His strength came in handy during the club's frequent relocations. Hells Angels chapters sometimes needed to move their operations quickly, whether to avoid law enforcement attention or to establish presence in new territory. When that happened, motorcycles, parts, tools, and other heavy equipment needed to be transported fast. Bletcher could load a truck in half the time it would take 4 normal men, working tirelessly while others took breaks. Beyond just lifting motorcycles, Bletcher understood them mechanically. His massive hands could apply torque to stubborn bolts that others couldn't budge. He could hold heavy engine blocks in position while others worked on mounting them. He could straighten bent frames and forks after accidents, using pure strength where others would need specialized tools. This combination of size, strength, and practical knowledge made him invaluable to the club beyond his intimidation factor. He wasn't just muscle, he was motorcycle muscle, specially adapted to the needs of an outlaw biker gang. In a world where your machine was your freedom and your identity, having someone who could manhandle those machines was a tremendous asset. When Bletcher died in 1975, one of the most memorable parts of his Hells Angels funeral was the motorcycle procession. His own bike was ridden at the front by another club member, while dozens of angels followed behind. The empty space where his massive frame should have been sitting served as a powerful reminder of just how unique he had been. a giant among men whose strength had become the stuff of biker legend. Bouncer extraordinaire. When Armon Bletcher stood at the door of a bar, trouble stayed outside. During the early 1970s, his reputation as a bouncer spread throughout California's roughest drinking establishments. Bar owners would pay premium rates just to have him work a single weekend night, knowing his presence alone would prevent the costly damages of bar fights and rowdy customers. Standing at the entrance, his massive frame blocking most of the doorway, Bletcher created an immediate impression on anyone trying to enter. His standard pose became legendary, arms crossed over his enormous chest, legs planted shoulder-width apart, head slightly lowered to look down at approaching patrons. He rarely smiled. He didn't need to say much. His body language communicated everything necessary: behave or leave. What made Bletcher different from typical bouncers wasn't just his size, though at 6 feet 8 inches and 350 pounds, he certainly had a physical advantage. It was his approach to the job. While many bouncers enjoyed the power trip and looked for excuses to get physical, Bletcher preferred prevention over confrontation. He could spot potential troublemakers before they even entered the building, noting subtle signs of aggression or excessive intoxication that others might miss. Even claimed their alcohol sales went up because customers felt safer and stayed longer. Bletcher worked at dozens of different establishments throughout Central and Northern California, from dive bars in Fresno to higher-end clubs in San Francisco. His reputation grew to the point that he could name his price, working only when and where he wanted. This freelance approach suited both his independent nature and his other commitments to the Hells Angels. Inside the bars, Bletcher developed a system for handling situations before they escalated. Rather than waiting for a full-blown fight to break out, he would notice when tensions were rising between patrons. A simple walk past the potential combatants, perhaps a casual hand on a shoulder or a meaningful look, was usually enough to diffuse the situation. His message was clear: not in this bar, not tonight. On the rare occasions when someone was foolish enough to start trouble despite his presence, Bletcher's response was swift and effective. He didn't brawl or create additional chaos. Instead, he would isolate the troublemaker, using his massive arms to wrap them up and simply carry them outside. The restraint he showed was notable. Very few people ever reported being injured by Bletcher while he was working security. This professional approach made him valuable beyond just biker bars. Nightclubs, concert venues, and even private parties sought his services. Word spread about the giant bouncer who could control a room without saying a word. The mystique around his Hells Angels membership only added to his effectiveness. People knew he wasn't just a big guy, but a man connected to a world where violence was taken seriously. Fellow bouncers who worked with Bletcher often described the experience as the easiest shift of their lives. With him handling the front door, their job became mostly ceremonial. Some bars even reduced their security staff on nights when Bletcher was scheduled, knowing one of him was worth 3 or 4 average men. Perhaps the ultimate testament to his skills came from law enforcement. Several police officers from that era later admitted they were relieved when they heard Bletcher was working at potentially problematic establishments. They knew calls from those locations would be fewer on those nights, and any situations that did arise would likely be contained before police arrival became necessary. When Armon Bletcher died in 1975, several bar owners in Fresno and surrounding towns closed for the evening as a sign of respect. For them, he hadn't just been muscle for hire. He had been a professional who made their businesses safer and more profitable through his unique presence and approach to security. Never lost a fight. In the rough-and-tumble world of 1970s biker culture, fighting wasn't just common, it was practically a job requirement. Most Hells Angels members had their share of victories and defeats. But according to biker law, Armon Bletcher stood apart with an undefeated record that became the stuff of legend. From barroom brawls to organized club fights, the giant angel reportedly never walked away on the losing end. This perfect record wasn't just luck or even his obvious size advantage. Bletcher approached fighting with the same methodical mindset he brought to everything else. While many bikers fought with wild, uncontrolled aggression, Bletcher remained calm and calculated even in the most chaotic situations. He sized up opponents quickly, identified weaknesses, and used only the force necessary to end the confrontation. His fighting style wasn't flashy. He didn't know formal martial arts or boxing techniques. What he had instead was an intuitive understanding of how to use his massive size effectively. His reach advantage meant he could hit opponents before they got close enough to strike him. His weight meant that even a glancing blow from his fist carried tremendous force, and his height allowed him to look down on most opponents, an immediate psychological advantage. One of his most effective tactics was surprisingly simple: the bear hug. When an opponent got too close, Bletcher would wrap his enormous arms around them, squeezing just enough to restrict breathing and movement without causing serious injury. Many fights ended right there, with his opponent unable to continue. Those who managed to break free usually found themselves too exhausted to put up much further resistance. Witnesses to Bletcher's fights often described the same pattern. The confrontation would begin, typically with his opponent showing bravado and aggression. Bletcher would stand calmly, hands at his sides, watching. When the opponent finally moved in, Bletcher's response was direct and overwhelming. One or two massive blows that ended things before they really began. It wasn't exciting or dramatic, it was efficient. Physical advantages aside, what truly set Bletcher apart was his pain tolerance. Where other fighters might be slowed down or distracted by injuries, he seemed almost immune to pain during combat. He would absorb punches, bottle strikes, even knife wounds in some accounts, and continue fighting with undiminished effectiveness. This wasn't just toughness, witnesses described it as something almost supernatural, as if pain signals simply didn't reach his brain during fights. By the time of his death in 1975, Bletcher's undefeated record had become an important part of Hell's Angels mythology. Whether he truly never lost a fight is impossible to verify now, but the consistency of the stories from multiple sources suggests that if he ever did taste defeat, it was rare enough to be forgotten in favor of the legend of the unbeatable giant. Tragic end. For a man who seemed almost invincible in fights, Armon Bletcher met his end in a surprisingly ordinary way. On November 25, 1975, the giant Hell's Angel was shot and killed by his own cousins, the Pasayan brothers, at their tire shop in Fresno, California. He was just 33 years old. The circumstances leading to his death read like something from a crime drama. According to reports, Bletcher was under investigation by the FBI for various illegal activities connected to his Hell's Angels membership. Looking for a way to explain his income to authorities, he approached his cousins about putting him on their tire shop's payroll as a cover. When they refused to get involved in his scheme, tension built between the relatives. On that fateful November day, Bletcher reportedly went to confront his cousins about their refusal. Despite his fearsome reputation and history of violence, he made a critical mistake. He went to the meeting unarmed. Perhaps he believed his size and intimidation factor would be enough, as it had been countless times before. The confrontation quickly escalated. The Pasayan brothers, fearing for their lives, allegedly struck Bletcher with a baseball bat. In a testament to his legendary toughness, even this didn't stop the giant angel. As he continued to advance, one brother fired warning shots at the ground. When these failed to deter Bletcher, Josh Pasayan fired 3 bullets directly at him. The shots hit Bletcher in the back and he fell. For a man who had shrugged off countless punches, broken bottles, and even knife wounds, it was plain lead bullets that finally proved his mortality. The brothers claimed self-defense against an unarmed but incredibly dangerous man, and no murder charges were filed. The Hells Angels gave Bletcher a proper biker funeral, with a long procession of motorcycles escorting his casket. Sonny Barger himself reportedly attended, a mark of respect for the fallen giant. In death, as in life, Bletcher stood out. His custom-made coffin was one of the largest ever ordered in Fresno County. The timing of Bletcher's death added another layer of tragedy to his story. Just when federal authorities were closing in on him, perhaps threatening his freedom, his life was cut short not by law enforcement but by family members. Some speculated that had he lived, he might have faced serious criminal charges related to the ongoing FBI investigation. Others suggested he was preparing to leave California altogether, possibly to start fresh in another Hells Angels chapter far from federal scrutiny. His death sent shockwaves through the outlaw biker community. For years, members had believed Bletcher was untouchable, a giant who could handle any physical threat. The fact that he could be killed by ordinary men with ordinary guns was a sobering reminder of mortality for everyone in the club. The most feared motorcycle club in history has faced many enemies, but none more dangerous than those from within. These are the stories of men who wore the winged death head patch, who lived by the code of angels forever, forever angels, yet whose actions nearly brought down the entire organization. Their tales of betrayal, greed, and revenge reveal how close the mighty Hells Angels came to complete destruction. The desperate father who started it all. Luke Cook never imagined that owning a failing bar in Thailand would lead him to death row. The Australian FIFO worker had built what he thought was a simple life in Pattaya, a modest bar and guest house that catered to expats looking for cheap drinks and even cheaper thrills. But in 2015, his businesses were hemorrhaging money faster than he could count. His savings had vanished into the tropical heat, and desperation was setting in like the Thai humidity that never seemed to lift. Cook represented everything that made him the perfect target for recruitment by international criminals. Married with 2 young sons, he had that family man image that made him appear trustworthy to anyone watching from the outside. His legitimate businesses provided perfect cover for illegal activities that nobody would suspect. Most importantly, his mounting financial troubles made him vulnerable to offers that seemed too good to be true. What Cook didn't know was that his predicament had already been noticed by someone far more dangerous than any debt collector. And this man's solution would eventually see Cook facing execution by the Thai government. The transformation from legitimate businessman to international drug smuggler began so slowly it was almost imperceptible. Antonio Bagnato, a fugitive Australian kickboxer, rented a room above Cook's bar and quickly became a regular fixture in his daily routine. Bagnato presented himself as just another Aussie expat trying to make a fresh start in Thailand, but his real identity was far more sinister than Cook could have imagined. He was a wanted man, having fled Australia after his involvement in the murder of 25-year-old Dylan over a debt dispute in August 2014. Cook's natural friendliness and genuine desire to help fellow Australians made him an easy mark for Bagnato's careful manipulation. As their friendship deepened over shared beers and stories of home, Cook began opening up about his financial struggles, unknowingly providing Bagnato with the intelligence he needed to assess Cook's potential value to his criminal associates. Every conversation about mounting debts, failing businesses, and sleepless nights worrying about his family's future was being mentally catalogued by a predator who saw golden opportunity in desperate circumstances. But Bagnato wasn't working alone in this elaborate setup. Through him, Cook was about to meet Wayne Schneider, a notorious Hells Angels member who would make Cook an offer that would change his life forever. What Cook couldn't have imagined was that accepting this offer would not only lead him to death row, but would also trigger a chain of betrayal and murder that would shake the Hells Angels organization to its very core. And this was just the beginning of a story that would eventually span multiple countries and destroy dozens of lives in its wake. The architect of a criminal empire. Wayne Schneider was already a legend in Australian criminal circles long before he stepped foot in Thailand. With 375 intelligence entries and 8 outstanding warrants against him, he had built a methamphetamine empire across Sydney's sprawling suburbs that supplied dealers throughout New South Wales. His laboratories in Newralin and Catherine Fields were sophisticated operations that produced industrial quantities of crystal methamphetamine. But when Australian police began closing in on his network, Schneider demonstrated the same cunning that had made him successful. He vanished into thin air. 2 days before police obtained their search warrant for his labs, Schneider had boarded a plane to Thailand, his new home and the base for what would become an even more ambitious criminal enterprise. The next day, Australian police found his abandoned laboratories, but by then their primary target was already on the opposite side of the world, planning operations that would make his Australian dealings look like small-time street dealing. In Pattaya's red light district, Schneider created something that would have made his American brothers proud. Angel's Place, a legitimate Hells Angels clubhouse that served as the nerve center for operations worth hundreds of millions of dollars. From this heavily fortified compound decorated with the club's distinctive Death's Head logo, he orchestrated drug shipments from Chinese laboratories to Australian streets, using a network of desperate expats and local contacts who were all too willing to risk everything for what seemed like easy money in paradise. Schneider's genius lay not in his ability to move drugs. Plenty of criminals could do that, but in his supernatural talent for reading people like open books. He could identify weakness, desperation, and greed with the precision of a surgeon, then exploit those vulnerabilities to build an army of unwitting accomplices who would do his dirty work while he remained safely in the shadows. When he looked at Luke Cook, he saw the perfect smuggler, a family man with maritime experience, legitimate businesses for cover, and the kind of financial desperation that would make him willing to take enormous risks for the promise of quick money. The plan that Schneider hatched would involve moving a ton of pure methamphetamine worth $300 million on Australian streets. The drugs would be manufactured in Chinese laboratories, transported by fishing trawler to international waters where no country's laws applied, then picked up by Cook using his legitimate yacht business as perfect cover. For Cook's services, Schneider was offering $10 million, more money than the struggling businessman had ever dreamed of making in his entire lifetime. But Schneider's towering ambition would ultimately become his downfall in ways he never anticipated. What he didn't foresee was that his trusted associate Antonio Bagnato was harboring deadly secrets of his own, and that their partnership would end in torture, murder, and the complete exposure of his entire criminal empire. The very greed and ruthless calculation that had built Schneider's success was about to destroy him. and nearly bring down the Hells Angels organization along with him in a spectacular fashion that would shock the international criminal underworld. The perfect crime that went horribly wrong. The night of June 15, 2015 should have been routine for Luke Cook, but it would end with him making a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his natural life. As his yacht cut through the dark waters of the South China Sea under a blanket of stars, Cook was probably thinking about what he would do with his $10 million payday. Pay off crushing debts, save his failing businesses, maybe even take his family on a proper vacation for the first time in years. What he wasn't thinking about was the Thai naval patrol that was quietly tracking his movements through the darkness with military precision. The rendezvous with the Chinese fishing trawler nicknamed Joandi went exactly as planned in those crucial first moments. 4 yellow sacks marked with red Chinese characters were transferred to Cook's yacht without incident, each one heavy with crystalline poison that would flood Australian streets for months and destroy countless lives. The exchange was quick, professional, and executed with the kind of efficiency that had made Wayne Schneider's reputation as one of Australia's most successful drug smugglers. But as Cook turned his yacht back toward the distant shore, lights suddenly appeared behind him in the darkness, like malevolent eyes. The Thai Navy had spotted him, and they were closing in fast with the determination of hunters who had found their prey. In that moment of pure panic that seemed to stretch for eternity, Cook faced a choice that would define the rest of his life: surrender with the drugs aboard and face certain execution under Thailand's harsh drug laws, or dump the cargo into the ocean and hope desperately for the best outcome possible. Cook chose to fight for his life in the only way he could, watching $300 million worth of methamphetamine sink into the depths of the ocean like stones. But his problems were just beginning to unfold in ways that would make this moment seem simple by comparison. While he had avoided immediate capture and possible execution, he had also just lost the most valuable cargo in Hells Angels history, and the organization that had trusted him with their fortune would not be understanding about his failure, regardless of the circumstances that had led to this disaster. What happened next would seem almost comical if the stakes weren't so deadly serious. Cook, desperate to recover the drugs and avoid the wrath of the Hells Angels, concocted an elaborate lie to trick his friend Douglas Shoebridge into helping him. He told Shoebridge, a professional diver with years of underwater experience, that he had lost some gold in the ocean during a diving accident and needed help recovering the precious treasure. Shoebridge, intrigued by the prospect of underwater treasure hunting and the promise of easy money, agreed to help without asking too many probing questions that might have revealed the truth. This moment of deception between Cook and Shoebridge would prove to be the catalyst for everything that followed, setting in motion a chain of events that would ultimately destroy everyone involved and expose the inner workings of an international criminal conspiracy. The unraveling of lies. But as Shoebridge dove into the murky waters, searching for what he believed was sunken gold treasure, Cook's carefully constructed web of lies began to unravel under the pressure of alcohol and overwhelming stress. The magnitude of his predicament, owing $300 million to the Hells Angels, combined with the desperate nature of their underwater search, caused Cook to make a confession that would change both their lives forever. Under the influence and consumed by panic, Cook revealed the truth about what they were really looking for in those dark waters. The revelation that they were searching for drugs, not gold, sent Shoebridge into an absolute fury that could be heard across the beach. The realization that he had been used, that he could have unwittingly aided in the recovery of enough drugs to supply entire cities, gnawed at his conscience and filled him with a rage that would later be used against Cook in a Thai courtroom. Cook was now paralyzed by panic that consumed his every waking moment. The debt he had accrued to the Hells Angels was like a ticking time bomb, and the vengeful specters of his criminal associates would soon come knocking at his door with violence in mind. The clock was ticking on his life, and their secret cargo, half a ton of pure ice, had gone missing in the depths of the ocean, probably lost forever to the currents and tides of the South China Sea. Everything that could go wrong had actually gone wrong in the most spectacular fashion possible. It was at this point that Antonio Bagnato's name once again surfaced as Cook's supposed lifeline, the old friend who had helped them clean up the mess they had created. But what Cook didn't understand was that Bagnato had his own agenda, one that involved eliminating everyone who could connect him to the failed operation, starting with the man who had made it all possible in the first place. The stage was being set for a betrayal that would shock even the hardened criminals of Pattaya's underworld, and Wayne Schneider, the architect of this entire operation, was about to discover that trust among thieves was nothing more than a dangerous illusion. The hunter becomes the hunted. News of the failed drug shipment reached Wayne Schneider at his perfectly named clubhouse Angel's Place, and his reaction was swift and brutal. A man who had built his reputation on successful operations and reliable deliveries was not about to accept the loss of $300 million without someone paying the ultimate price. The $10 million he had promised Cook was nothing compared to the fortune that now lay at the bottom of the South China Sea, and Schneider's rage was the kind that demanded blood as payment. What Schneider didn't realize in those crucial hours was that his own life was already in mortal danger from someone he trusted completely. Antonio Bagnato had been planning Schneider's murder long before the drug shipment went wrong. The kickboxer saw Schneider's wealth, power, and extensive criminal network as an opportunity to advance his own position in Thailand's criminal hierarchy, and the failed smuggling operation gave him the perfect excuse to eliminate his partner while appearing to be seeking justice for the lost drugs. The plan that Bagnato hatched was elegant in its simplicity and brutal in its execution. All he needed was an opportunity to get Schneider alone and vulnerable, away from the security of Angel's Place and the protection of his fellow Hells Angels members. That opportunity came on November 30th, 2015, when tensions over the failed drug shipment reached their absolute breaking point. Schneider was lured from his heavily fortified compound on the pretext of a business meeting that promised to resolve the situation with Cook and the missing drugs. What he didn't know was that Bagnato and 4 other men were waiting for him in an upscale Pattaya residential complex, armed and ready to settle their accounts permanently. The kidnapping was captured in vivid detail on CCTV footage that would later become crucial evidence in the prosecution of everyone involved. Security guard Sufan 5th Awakong witnessed the entire abduction as it unfolded before his eyes. He watched in horror as 5 men ruthlessly assaulted Schneider before bundling him into the back of a white Toyota utility vehicle. Only one of the attackers wasn't wearing a mask to conceal his identity: Antonio Bagnato, whose face was clearly visible on the security cameras. This crucial oversight would ultimately lead to his downfall, but not before he had accomplished his primary objective of eliminating Wayne Schneider forever. What followed was 9 hours of torture and interrogation that would have broken most men, but Schneider showed remarkable courage in his final hours on Earth. Despite the unimaginable pain inflicted upon him, he refused to give up information about his hidden assets, ongoing operations. His defiance in the face of certain death prevented his killers from gaining access to the full extent of his criminal empire, but it also sealed his fate in the most brutal way possible. The web of betrayal expands. The murder of Wayne Schneider sent shockwaves through the international criminal community, but the reverberations were felt most strongly by Luke Cook, who suddenly found himself caught between multiple deadly forces. Not only was he still responsible for the lost drug shipment that had started this entire nightmare, but he was also connected to Schneider's killer through their shared living arrangements and business relationships, a connection that would soon see him facing the death penalty in a Bangkok courtroom. Cook's involvement with Bagnato ran much deeper than most people realized at the time. When Bagnato fled Thailand after Schneider's murder, it was Cook who provided the getaway car and helped him reach the Cambodian border. This act of loyalty to a friend would later be used against Cook in court, painting him as an active participant in the criminal conspiracy, rather than an unwitting victim who had been manipulated by more experienced criminals. The escape to Cambodia was a desperate gambit that involved multiple people and revealed the true extent of the criminal network operating throughout Southeast Asia. Tyler Gerard, a 22-year-old Australian who had broken his collarbone in a motorcycle accident just days before, found himself unwittingly involved in the escape plan when Bagnato called him for help. Gerard later testified that about 9 hours after Schneider's kidnapping, Bagnato had contacted him in a state of panic, asking for assistance to flee the country because he was scared and needed help from someone he considered a friend. But even as Bagnato was fleeing justice across international borders, Cook was being drawn deeper into the web of criminal activity that surrounded him like quicksand. The Thai police were methodically closing in, using CCTV footage, witness testimony, and financial records to piece together the connections between all the players in this deadly game. Cook's involvement in both the failed drug smuggling operation and Bagnato's escape made him a prime target for arrest and prosecution under Thailand's harsh criminal justice system. What made Cook's situation even more precarious was the nature of his other associates in this criminal conspiracy. Douglas Shoebridge, the man he had tricked into diving for the lost drugs, wasn't just an innocent dupe caught up in Cook's schemes. According to Cook's father, Shoebridge was a human trafficker with extensive connections to African prostitution rings operating throughout Bangkok, and his testimony against Cook would prove to be devastating when the case finally went to trial years later. The convergence of all these criminal enterprises, drug smuggling, murder, human trafficking, and international fugitive operations, created a perfect storm of evidence that would ultimately trap Cook and his wife in the Thai justice system for years to come. But their ordeal was just beginning to unfold, and halfway around the world, another drama was developing within the Hells Angels organization that would prove equally destructive to the club's reputation and international operations. The rebel who defied an empire, Aygun Muchuk's rise to power within the German Hells Angels had been marked by violence and betrayal from the very beginning. Nearly 2 years before his brutal assassination, he had staged a coup against longtime member Schnitzel Walter, sparking turmoil throughout the entire German organization and challenging the traditional power structure that had kept the club stable for decades. According to the Hells Angels' own sacred rules and codes of conduct, such an attack should have resulted in Muchuk's immediate expulsion from the club, but instead of being punished, he was allowed to remain and even establish his own charter in Geishan. This act of rebellion didn't go unnoticed by the American Hells Angels leadership, who viewed the German situation with growing alarm and concern for their global operations. The club's international structure depended entirely on strict hierarchy and absolute obedience to American authority. But Muchuk's actions represented a direct challenge to that system that threatened to undermine their control over chapters worldwide. His defiance reflected the growing influence of Turkish bikers, led by Neko Arabaci, who had systematically filled the void left by Frank Hannebuth's arrest in Mallorca and were pushing for more autonomy from American oversight. The American leadership understood that Germany was absolutely crucial to their global operations and their ability to maintain control over European chapters. In secret meetings held in neutral locations, they attempted to maintain peace between the old-school German bikers who had built the organization and the young Turkish-originated upcomers who represented the future of the club in Europe. These diplomatic efforts were conducted with the same seriousness as international peace negotiations, because everyone involved understood that the stakes were incredibly high. But Muchuk, driven by an insatiable thirst for power and convinced of his own invincibility, ignored all warnings and appeals for diplomatic resolution. He seemed to believe that his position within Germany and his connections to the Turkish criminal underworld made him untouchable, that the American leadership was too distant and too focused on their domestic operations to effectively challenge his growing authority in European affairs. The Americans' patience finally ran out when it became crystal clear that Muchuk had no intention of backing down or accepting their traditional authority over international chapters. In a decision that would send shockwaves through the international biker community and demonstrate the brutal reach of American power, they severed all ties with Muchuk and effectively marked him for death. The message was unmistakably clear to everyone in the organization. No one, regardless of their power, connections, or regional influence, could defy the American Hells Angels and expect to survive the consequences. The execution of this death sentence came with the kind of brutal efficiency that had made the Hells Angels feared throughout the criminal underworld, setting the stage for an even more devastating betrayal that was developing within the organization's North American operations. The making of the ultimate traitor. David Atwell's journey from respected member to the highest-ranking traitor in Hells Angels history began in the most mundane way possible, with financial troubles and growing disillusionment with the criminal lifestyle he had embraced. Born in 1965 in Scarborough, a middle-class Toronto suburb, he had grown up in a loving family with absolutely no intention of ever joining a motorcycle club or becoming involved in organized crime. It was only after working as a bouncer and security guard that he first encountered members of the Paradise Riders, a local outlaw biker club that would change the trajectory of his entire life. The mass patchover ceremony of December 29, 2000, transformed Atwell from a small-time club member into a Hells Angel overnight in one of the most significant events in Canadian criminal history. Along with 167 other bikers from various Ontario outlaw gangs, including Satan's Choice, the Vagabonds, the Lobos, the Last Chance, the Paradise Riders, and some of the Loners, he suddenly found himself part of the most powerful criminal organization in North America. This transition gave Greater Toronto the highest concentration of Hells Angels chapters anywhere in the world, creating an unprecedented concentration of criminal power in a single metropolitan area. What Atwell discovered about life as a Hells Angel was both intoxicating and ultimately disappointing in ways he never could have anticipated. The power and respect that came with wearing the patch were absolutely undeniable. Doors opened without question, debts were forgiven immediately, and fear followed in his wake wherever he went throughout his territory. As he later wrote in his memoir, being a Hells Angel meant never waiting in line at any bar in Scarborough, always finding a great seat reserved for him, and having a cold beer waiting before he even sat down. His patch functioned like an unlimited credit card that he never had to pay off, granting him access to anything he wanted. But behind the glamour and intimidation was a criminal enterprise that demanded complete loyalty while offering little genuine support in return. When Atwell was arrested on drug trafficking charges in April 2002, he discovered that his club brothers were far more concerned about protecting themselves than helping him through his legal troubles. He was forced to move back into his father's house to save money on mounting legal fees, and was even fired from his security job when his association with the Hells Angels was discovered during a background check for an event attended by Prime Minister Paul Martin. The experience of fighting serious criminal charges essentially alone, despite being part of a supposedly tight-knit brotherhood, planted the first seeds of doubt in Atwell's mind about the true nature of the organization he had joined. He began to question whether the Hells Angels were really the family they claimed to be, or just a collection of selfish criminals using each other for personal gain while abandoning members who faced legal troubles. These doubts would fester for several years before finally erupting into the most devastating act of betrayal in the organization's history. Project Develop: The Beginning of the End. In March 2005, Atwell's growing disillusionment with the Hells Angels converged with an opportunity from law enforcement that seemed almost too good to be true. Officers from the Ontario Provincial Police Anti-Biker Enforcement Unit approached him with a carefully crafted offer of $1,850 per week in exchange for information about Hells Angels activities, plus complete immunity from prosecution for his cooperation in what they called Project Develop. What made the offer particularly appealing to Atwell was that it perfectly aligned with his own moral misgivings about the direction his life had taken since joining the organization. He had originally joined the Paradise Riders because he genuinely enjoyed riding motorcycles and wanted to be part of a brotherhood based on shared interests and mutual support, but the Hells Angels had transformed that innocent dream into a nightmare of criminal activity, paranoia, and constant danger. The police were offering him a way out of this lifestyle while also providing the financial security he would need to start over completely. The decision to become an informant wasn't one that Atwell made lightly, understanding fully the consequences of betraying the most dangerous criminal organization in North America. He knew that discovery would mean certain death delivered in the most brutal fashion possible, and that even success would require him to spend the rest of his life in hiding under witness protection. But the alternative, continuing to live as part of an organization that he no longer believed in or respected, seemed even worse than the risks associated with betrayal. Atwell's work as an informant began slowly and cautiously, with seemingly innocent conversations and casual observations about routine club activities. But as his police handlers gained confidence in his abilities and the value of his information, they began asking for increasingly specific and dangerous intelligence. He was equipped with sophisticated recording devices and asked to document conversations about weapons trafficking, drug operations, and planned criminal activities that could result in serious charges against his former brothers. The psychological toll of living as a double agent was enormous and began taking a serious toll on Atwell's mental health. He was forced to maintain normal relationships with men he was secretly betraying on a daily basis, attending their weddings and family gatherings, sharing their most intimate secrets, and pretending to be loyal while systematically gathering evidence that would ultimately destroy their lives and send them to prison for decades. By 2006, the information that Atwell was providing to Project Develop had enabled police to build solid cases against dozens of Hells Angels members across Ontario. But it had also made his position exponentially more dangerous as other informant operations began yielding results that made everyone in the organization suspicious and paranoid about potential betrayal from within their own ranks. The final confrontation. The confrontation that Atwell had been dreading for months finally came in late 2006, and it was every bit as brutal as he had feared it would be. His chapter leaders cornered him in a private meeting and demanded to know directly if he was working for the police, threatening to kill him immediately if they discovered he was the informant they had been desperately searching for. The threat was absolutely credible. The Hells Angels had a long and documented history of murdering traitors in the most brutal fashion possible, and Atwell knew that his life was literally hanging by a thread. That same night, faced with the very real possibility that his cover had been blown completely, Atwell's police handlers made the decision that would end his life as a Hells Angel forever. They ordered him into immediate witness protection and began preparing for the massive coordinated raids that would use his information to systematically destroy the organization he had once served with apparent loyalty. The boy from Scarborough, who had just wanted to ride motorcycles with his friends, was about to become the most important witness in Canadian criminal history. The raids that followed Atwell's extraction from his dangerous position were devastating in their scope and effectiveness. In April 2007, police forces across Ontario simultaneously struck at Hells Angels clubhouses, safe houses, and personal residences, arresting 31 members and seizing millions of dollars worth of drugs, weapons, and cash in coordinated operations that had been planned for months. While the raids were the result of years of careful intelligence gathering from multiple sources, it was Atwell's testimony that provided the crucial evidence needed to secure convictions that would stand up in court. The trial that followed stretched from September 2010 to May 2011, making it one of the longest-running trials in Canadian history, with Atwell serving as the star witness for the prosecution. His testimony revealed the inner workings of the Hells Angels organization in unprecedented detail, exposing everything from their sophisticated drug trafficking operations to their methods of intimidation, violence, and control over criminal territories throughout Ontario. Despite aggressive attacks on his credibility from defense attorneys who portrayed him as a violent criminal seeking only to save himself from prosecution, most of the defendants were ultimately convicted on serious charges ranging from drug trafficking to weapons possession. The convictions represented the single greatest law enforcement victory against the Hells Angels in Canadian history, effectively dismantling their Ontario operations and sending a clear message that no criminal organization was beyond the reach of determined law enforcement. But these victories came at an enormous personal cost for the man who had made them possible, as Atwell discovered when he tried to build a new life under witness protection. The price of ultimate betrayal. Since 2007, David Atwell has lived under witness protection, an existence he describes as profoundly lonely and marked by constant movement and complete lack of stability. The isolation required by his situation means he cannot form meaningful relationships with anyone, because any close connection would inevitably lead to questions about his past that he cannot answer without potentially exposing his identity and location to the Hells Angels members who continue searching for him. As Atwell explained in painful detail, he can only imagine getting close to someone, whether in a friendship, platonic relationship, or intimate relationship with the opposite sex. He can only go so far before that person who cares for him asks the inevitable questions about what happened before, where he came from, and what his life was like before witness protection. These are questions he cannot answer honestly with anyone, creating a barrier to genuine human connection that defines his entire existence. Moreover, Atwell lives in constant paranoia and fear because the Hells Angels organization continues actively looking for him with the goal of exacting their revenge for his betrayal. The organization has never forgotten what he did to them, and they have made it clear through various channels that finding and killing him remains a priority that will never be abandoned, regardless of how many years pass or how well hidden he believes himself to be. While Atwell was beginning his lonely life in witness protection, his betrayal had created a template and methodology that law enforcement agencies around the world would adapt and use to infiltrate and destroy other criminal organizations. His success had definitively proven that even the most secretive, violent, and paranoid criminal groups were vulnerable to betrayal from within their own ranks, setting the stage for similar operations against Hells Angels chapters worldwide and other criminal organizations that had previously seemed untouchable. Meanwhile, halfway around the world, Luke Cook and his wife were about to face their own reckoning as Thai authorities finally moved to arrest them for their role in the failed drug smuggling operation that had started this entire chain of deadly events. The reckoning in Bangkok. December 2017 marked the beginning of the end for Luke Cook and his Thai wife Kanyarat, though they had no idea what awaited them as they stepped off the plane at Bangkok's Suvarnabhumi airport. Returning from what they believed was a routine trip to Australia to visit family, they were immediately arrested by Thai authorities who had been methodically building their case for over 2 years, using CCTV footage, financial records, witness testimony, and confessions from captured co-conspirators. The charges against them were staggering in both scope and severity: conspiracy to import methamphetamine, money laundering, membership in a transnational criminal organization, and accessory to murder. Thai prosecutors had constructed what they believed was an absolutely ironclad case, using evidence that revealed the full scope of Wayne Schneider's criminal operation for the first time. Global Marine Solutions, the front company that had purchased the yacht used in the smuggling attempt, was directly connected to Cook and his wife through an extensive web of financial transactions and legal documents that painted them as central figures in the conspiracy. What made the prosecution's case even more damning was the devastating testimony of Douglas Shoebridge, who had agreed to cooperate with authorities in exchange for leniency in his own serious legal troubles. Shoebridge painted Cook as a calculating criminal mastermind who had deliberately deceived him about the true nature of their underwater recovery mission. presenting Cook's drunken confession about the drugs as evidence of his guilty knowledge and active participation from the very beginning of the operation. The trial itself became a grueling 4-year ordeal, during which Cook and his wife were held in some of Thailand's most notorious prisons under conditions that were harsh even by local standards. Their access to adequate legal representation was severely limited by financial constraints and language barriers, while the overwhelming weight of evidence against them seemed to make conviction inevitable. Thailand's justice system had developed a well-deserved reputation for imposing harsh sentences in drug cases, making the death penalty not just a possibility, but a strong probability given the scale of the operation they were accused of facilitating. On November 14, 2018, at exactly 5:30 p.m., Luke Cook and his wife stood in a Bangkok courtroom and heard the words they had been dreading for years. Guilty on all charges, sentenced to death. The father of two was led away in chains, facing the very real possibility of execution for crimes that had begun with nothing more than a desperate desire to save his failing businesses and provide security for his family. But their story was far from over as international pressure began building for a review of their case and the circumstances surrounding their conviction. The aftermath and unexpected redemption. The international outcry that followed Cook's death sentence was immediate and sustained, with lobbyist groups and Australian parliamentarians demanding a thorough review of the case. Critics pointed to numerous procedural errors in the trial, inadequate legal representation, and questions about the reliability of key witness testimony that had formed the foundation of the prosecution's case against Cook and his wife. After 4 years of unimaginable horror in Thai prisons, during which Cook and his wife faced the daily possibility of execution, their persistence and the efforts of their supporters finally paid off. An appeals court cited significant procedural errors and constitutional violations in their original trial, ultimately overturning their convictions and commuting their death sentences. They returned to Australia as free people, though forever marked by their ordeal and serving as a living cautionary tale about the devastating consequences of becoming involved with international criminal organizations. Their case demonstrated both the global reach of modern criminal networks and the international cooperation required to combat them effectively, while also highlighting the human cost of drug trafficking operations that destroy lives on multiple continents. Cook's story serves as a powerful reminder that the criminal underworld preys specifically on desperation and financial vulnerability, turning what seems like an easy solution to money problems into a nightmare of violence, imprisonment, and potential death. The murders of Wayne Schneider and Agun Muchuk illustrated the brutal internal dynamics that continue to plague outlaw motorcycle clubs around the world, showing that these organizations may present themselves as brotherhoods bound by loyalty and honor, but the reality is often very different. A world where betrayal and murder are commonplace tools of business and survival. David Atwell's ongoing life in witness protection represents the permanent consequences of betraying powerful criminal organizations, serving simultaneously as both an inspiration to other potential informants who might be considering cooperation with law enforcement and a sobering warning about the price that must inevitably be paid for such decisions. The legacy of destruction. The men who almost destroyed the Hells Angels succeeded in ways they never intended or anticipated. Through their individual acts of greed, violence, and betrayal, they exposed fundamental vulnerabilities within the organization and provided law enforcement agencies worldwide with the intelligence, methodology, and evidence needed to strike devastating blows against criminal operations that had previously seemed untouchable. Today, the Hells Angels organization continues to operate in countries around the world, but it has been forever changed by the events described in these interconnected stories of betrayal and destruction. The mass arrests and convictions that resulted from operations like Project Develop have made the organization significantly more paranoid and security conscious in their operations. But they have also revealed critical vulnerabilities that law enforcement agencies continue to exploit through similar infiltration and informant operations. The case of Luke Cook and his wife demonstrates the truly global reach of modern criminal networks and the level of international cooperation that has become necessary to combat them effectively. Their 4-year ordeal in the Thai justice system serves as a stark reminder of how quickly ordinary people can become entangled in criminal conspiracies that span multiple countries and involve organizations capable of extreme violence. The stories of Wayne Schneider's torture and murder by Antonio Bagnato and Agun Muchuk's assassination for defying American authority illustrate the violent internal dynamics that continue to characterize outlaw motorcycle clubs throughout the world. These organizations may market themselves to potential members and the general public as brotherhoods based on loyalty, honor, and mutual support. But the reality revealed by these cases is often very different. A brutal world where betrayal and murder are routine business practices. David Atwell's transformation from loyal member to the most damaging informant in Hell's Angels history demonstrates that no criminal organization, regardless of its reputation for violence or its emphasis on loyalty and silence, is immune to infiltration and destruction from within its own ranks. His success in helping law enforcement dismantle major criminal operations proved that even the most secretive and paranoid organizations have fundamental weaknesses that can be exploited by determined investigators working with inside sources. The legacy of these 5 men continues to reverberate through the international criminal underworld years after the events described here took place. Their stories serve as both cautionary tales for those who might be tempted by the apparent glamour and easy money offered by criminal organizations, and as inspiration for law enforcement agencies seeking to develop new strategies for combating organized crime in an increasingly connected global economy. The greatest threat to the Hell's Angels has never been rival criminal organizations, aggressive law enforcement operations, or government crackdowns. It has been the very men who wore their patches, claimed to uphold their values, and then chose personal gain over organizational loyalty when the stakes became high enough. The line between brotherhood and betrayal, it turns out, is often much thinner than anyone realizes until it has already been crossed permanently.